Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Ryan K, Stephen P, Mr. Biscuits, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Eric H, Matt aka Stormageddon, and Gilmer have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, we're in the shadow of the third pillar. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode, it is a celebration. It is a celebration of 20 years of the Nintendo DS. That is right, 20 years ago, close to the date this episode is coming out. The Nintendo DS released in North America on November 21st, 2004. And this episode is just coming out a few days earlier than that. So we're here to celebrate it. And joining me to celebrate the dual screen monster that is the Nintendo DS, we'll start off with a guest who hasn't been on the show in quite some time, Bill from the Gaming and Collecting podcast and a number of other shows. Bill, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, Josh. I can't believe the year's almost over. I'm not going to lie, but it's been good. I'm doing all right.
It's good to hear. It's good to hear. Last time you were on, I think we did the Uncharted Golden Abyss episode because we actually met in person and recorded that at a Retro World Expo.
Yep, we recorded in a Holiday Inn, I believe.
Yeah, in a bedroom in a Holiday Inn, and that's as sexy as it sounds. Everyone talking Uncharted in a Holiday Inn.
It's still my my Facebook profile picture.
Oh, really? The picture I took of you?
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. And our other guest joining us to talk about the Nintendo DS, Aidan Moher. Aidan, how are you doing today?
Hey guys, I'm doing good. I have been raiding my kids' Halloween candy, so I am just chock full of sugar and ready to go.
That's what I like to hear. That's what I like to hear. I think the last time you were on was probably for the Final Fantasy Draft last year. I don't think you've been on an episode this year yet, have you? No, Chrono Trigger. We did Chrono Trigger this summer. Oh my goodness, Chrono Trigger. Just a couple months ago.
And that episode was so long, we actually just finished recording it like 3 days ago.
Right. Yeah, man, I'm happy to have you back on. And I didn't even say what you did at the top of the episode. Aidan here is an author, as frequent listeners of the show would probably remember him from numerous previous episodes. But at the top of the episode, why don't you just talk a bit about some of the stuff you write about?
Sure. I write about video games, specifically old video games and usually like RPGs. I wrote a book. It came out about 2 years ago called Fight Magic Items. It's the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. So it looks at their sort of transition from sort of, niche game on the NES and even the Super NES to their big explosion in the PlayStation and where things went from there. And I'm working on my next book, which is going to be right up the alley of anyone, who enjoyed Fight Magic Items. And then you can find me around the web, freelancing and writing for places like Wired, and written for Washington Post and IGN and a whole bunch of other places. So I'm around.
All right. So yes, everyone, I've said it a bunch of times before. Please go check out Fight Magic Items. It is a fantastic book, definitely worth your time. But let's dive into this episode now, shall we? We're talking about the Nintendo DS, and we always like to kick it off with memories. What's some of our first experiences with the system? How we kind of came to know it. And Bill, I'm going to start off with you. How did you first kind of experience the DS? What's some of your earliest memories surrounding it, and even some of your fondest ones? What do you got?
So the DS was an interesting one when it first came out. I always remember, I always forget it came out so early, like in 2004.
Mm-hmm.
When I remember first seeing the ads for it, I was so young at the time. I don't remember the E3 presentation with that abomination of a prototype they had uh, going on there. But I remember it was kind of just the natural progression. Like we had all the Game Boys by that point. Like I'd gone through the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, the SP. So it was kind of like when the DS came out, it just seemed like that was the natural next thing to get. Like I don't even think PSP was announced, but I don't think I really thought about it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe it was the Christmas of '05. Or no, actually, no, I think it was the Christmas of that year when the DS came out. Um, I got the original silver fat DS, and I just remember being like perplexed by it at first. Like the two screens, I just did not understand like what the idea was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also remember because I was so young, I didn't understand how the cartridges worked. So I remember I put Mario 64 DS in, and I didn't know how to get it out because I didn't realize you had to click it back in to get it to eject. So that was a bit of a struggle for a while there. Um, but yeah, I remember playing. That was actually my first experience with Mario 64, believe it or not, because I was a PlayStation kid growing up. So I finally got to have the Mario 64 3D experience.
Not the
And
best experience, but it's an experience.
honestly, because that's the one I grew up with, I actually have more nostalgia for that version. And when I play like original 64 now, it just feels wrong to me for some reason.
That's so bizarre. Okay, okay.
I also had, so it was interestingly enough, I actually was, because all my family members knew I was getting the DS for that year's Christmas, I got from my parents, I got Mario 64 and the Herb Sims of the City. Uh,
Okay.
I have a lot to say about that game, so maybe I'll save that for later. But from family members, I also ended up getting the other two launch titles, where I ended up getting Asphalt Racing and Spider-Man 2. So
Oh,
I had the full smorgasbord of the games at the time. I also had that Metroid Prime First Hunt demo cart.
oh,
Um,
Metro Prime Hunters.
yeah, for the First Hunt demo, which was basically you played around this one little area and you couldn't really do much. But yeah, I remember spending just like so many like hours just like messing around in Mario 64, attempting to play the other games. There wasn't a lot of content there with those ones, but yeah, that was kind of my first experience with it. I also played a lot of Game Boy Advance because it had that wonderful Game Boy Advance port on the bottom as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Aiden, what about yourself? What are your experiences with the DS?
Yeah, so like I came to the DS, very similar story. To Bill, I got it for Christmas in 2004 from my parents. I was like a big Nintendo sicko up until that point,
Mm-hmm.
and and PlayStation. I played all the, I had a PlayStation and loved it. But like growing up, I was a Nintendo sicko, so I was aware and familiar with the sort of disastrous first reveal of the DS when it had that awful design. The first time they showed it off, but I was still excited for it because, the Game Boy, I'd grown up with a Game Boy and never put it down. Game Boy Advance SP was like the first thing I bought with my money I made from a real job. And so like it was a foregone conclusion I was going to get the Nintendo DS. And, I asked for it for Christmas from my parents, and I was sure I was gonna get it. I was keyed in. I think I actually bought Super Mario 64 DS before I got the console.
Preemptively.
And then so Christmas morning came out, and we went out, and some of the gifts were laid out under the tree, and my brothers got some cool stuff. My younger brothers, they got their Lego or a new video camera or whatever it was they got that year. And sitting out from my parents were just two little like dumbbells, like little weightlifting things, because I had been like going to the gym or whatever. And I was like, okay, well, I'm getting a little old. I guess I got ahead of myself. And so, I tried to play it cool, like try not to seem too disappointed. And then as I went through my stocking, I pulled this and that and everything out. And then buried at the bottom of the stocking was a DS. And my mom just started cackling.
Oh, that's awesome.
In hindsight, it was funny. At the time, I was I was a little shell shocked, but that was my first experience with the DS. And at that point, like the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance were so like console focused, right? Like they kind of gave
Yeah.
console experiences on the go or tried to like adapt those on the go. So right off the bat, you had something like Super Mario 64 that was like a console experience, but trying to bring the touch screen in and all that kind of stuff. But then like the first reveal of the DS was such a disaster that there wasn't a lot of software support. And Bill kind of mentioned this. Like a lot of the games early on were really experimental and weird, right? Feel the magic or
Mhm.
whatever that was. Like a lot of mini game
I-
collections. And so like at first it
Yep.
didn't really give me what I, like I liked playing the Final Fantasy ports on my Game Boy Advance and Lunar Legend and, all of those sorts of things. And then the DS came along and it's a lot of like Yoshi Touch and Go, like weird things where
Yeah.
like they sort of eschewed everything that made the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo and the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance popular for these sort of experimental like tech demo-y experiences. And so I think at first I was a little like not disappointed, but it didn't like slot in to that place where the Game Boy Advance was. Like Bill was saying, it came with a Game Boy Advance slot, and I probably ended up playing more Game Boy Advance games on it at first. But then it blew up and became hugely successful, and that's when we started getting sort of more robust games. And over the course of its lifespan, I think it, in my opinion, turned into one of the kind of best gaming consoles of all time because of the variety. You got the weird stuff, like the mini game collections. You got the traditional stuff like the Dragon Quest ports or Dragon Quest 9, Chrono Trigger, all the JRPGs. And then you got stuff like Hotel Dusk. You got the adventure games
Mhm.
and stuff that couldn't be done on other consoles that really like thought through like how can we use the touch screen to the fullest advantage. So you got the Layton games, you got, like the Phoenix Wright ports that really use the touchscreen well as they came over from Game Boy. And so by the end of the lifespan, it really, really grew on me. And now I look back on it and the DS library coupled with the fact that you have access to the entire Game Boy Advance and Game Boy libraries, it's just like it's untouched, I think.
Well, not Game Boy, but Game Boy Advance.
Didn't it do Game Boy? I think it did Game.
No, Game Boy Advance did Game Boy and Game
Boy
Boy
Advance
but
did Game Boy.
DS was only GBA
Was it
compatible, which is weird because you could technically probably fit a Game Boy cartridge in a DS.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. Huh. I had that memory of playing it, but them sticking out the bottom. But I must be thinking of my SP with the Game Boy cart sticking out of the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
But even so, Game Boy Advance and DS together, that library was it's just like the breadth of it. The number of classic games you can play on a DS is just wild.
It's insane. For myself, the DS, it is a bit more of a slow burn. Like I have a lot more memories around the system at like way after it was contemporary. I first got introduced to it. It was probably like I had heard of it when it came out, but no one I knew really had a DS. Even in my high school, it wasn't until I got to college that I started seeing more people play it. And I went to college in 2007, so it was already like 3 years into the DS's life cycle, and I remember the first handheld console that I actually owned that I bought with my own money was actually a PSP, which we will have to touch on because part of the big part of the narrative around the launch of the DS is very closely tied with the PSP, and we'll get into all that in a little bit. But so I got a PSP first, but then I had a coworker of mine. I used to work at a deli, and I had a coworker of mine named Joe, and we would make sandwiches there. We would slice deli meat. We would bring customers up. It was it was like this little mom and pop deli shop type of thing, and you just kind of do a little bit of everything. Dishes, making food, making sandwiches, making deli meat orders, bringing people up, all that good stuff. And we became really good friends. And one of the things that he would do is he would bring in his DS to work, and we would play games on it in between orders. We would actually, specifically the Age of Empires game for the DS. I think it's Age of Empires 2. It was You couldn't do real time on that, so it was all turn based. So him and I would just play turn based games, and we would take turns in between customer orders. So while one person was bringing up a customer, the other one was making their turn, and then we'd swap out. It was really cool, really fun memory surrounding that. I like that's what made me want to get a DS. I also played the Super Mario 64 DS for the first time there as well on his DS. I was actually more enthralled in the mini games than I was in the game itself. It might have actually been New Super Mario Brothers. Now that I think of it, it might have been New Super Mario Bros, not not Super Mario 64. But that was my first experience with the system. That's how I kind of first got to know it. I ended up going out to GameStop and bought a pre-owned, like a refurbished or used one, which I still have. I'm pretty sure it's at my parents' house right now, though. But which I still have, and that was when I started playing the system. But the problem is that the reason the system has a couple life cycles for me, like I got it when it was contemporary. But after I bought it, I didn't really touch it. I barely played any of the games with it. It honestly, it took a long time for me to actually sit down and complete any handheld games, just period. It wasn't until I got the Vita and the 3DS that I started playing more handheld games. And I've been playing a lot more DS games ever since I started the podcast because it's been giving me like a reason to like really sit down and spend time with it. So it's weird how it goes. I have all the memories around the deli. I buy a DS, so much so that I buy a DS and then never touch the damn thing. Start getting into handheld games with the Vita. Still don't really play it just yet. But then one of the things that like really kicked off my interest in it, and it's surreal to think about now, was Retronauts. Retronauts, the podcast has been going on for so long. I shout them out all the time. One of my favorite shows. One of my favorite episodes of theirs that they ever did was on the Nintendo DS. They had Kat Bailey on, they had Henry Gilbert, Bob and Jeremy obviously were on. I think that was the whole panel. There might have been one other. But that episode is 10 years old now. That episode on the DS is approaching 10 years because they did it for the 10th anniversary of the DS. And it's weird to me to hear that because I remember when that episode was new, and it's really making this passage of time feel uncomfortable for me. I'm not going to lie. But yeah, so that was my experience with the DS. It was Deli and then Retronauts, and like I have a lot of fond memories of the DS for so many different reasons, between the stuff at the Deli, between the games that I have legitimately played for it, and then also just like, how can I describe this? The DS is kind of synonymous to me with like the retro gaming community or the gaming community at large. I feel like almost everyone has this like connection to it in some way, shape, or form, and it almost reminds me of when I got into podcasting because I started the show 10 years ago now. The Retronauts episode came out 10 years ago, and it's just kind of like it feels like it's all syncing up a little bit. So the DS means a lot to me, but not for its games. It's for everything else that surrounds it. I know that's what a lot of nostalgia is. It's not necessarily just the act of playing a game. It's what was going on in your life around the time you were playing said game. Well, the DS was around for so many different parts of my life. College, the start of the podcast, and over the last couple of years, just really getting to know and enjoy the library even more. So
yeah. You bring up like Retronauts, and I think like taking that even further, like extrapolating backwards, like I was really into the 1UP, site and all the content that they created. And so 1UP Yours and the 1UP Show. And it's, you say that, but the DS at the time was like the new popular handheld console. And I was really into handheld console gaming at that time. And so I think there was sort of like that almost zeitgeist feel of what the DS meant to the, gaming community at that time, because it was the first time that, the kids who grew up sort of in the 80s and 90s were becoming adults and going through this transition where it was like, oh, okay, these things can not only just be little distraction devices for kids, but they can be things that adults bring around with them on the daily basis. And whether that was playing games or, Nintendo's push into stuff like brain training, right? And Nintendogs and these more sort of casual adult focused experiences really does sort of lend a feel to that particular transitional time in gaming, and how the games media was covering it, and how we just, you know, saw coverage of video games so heavily focused on the idea that, like, as we have these adult lives that are becoming more complex, we're out of the house more, we might have less free time. Taking gaming devices with us was really important at that point.
I kind of miss the gaming on the. I kind of miss dedicated portable gaming devices. Like, I know the Switch is basically that now, but you still need to, like, you need to carry the Switch like it's a laptop, you know. And I'm not trying to denigrate the Switch. I love the system, but I genuinely miss, like, being able to just stick a handheld in your pocket,
Yeah.
you know.
I mean, I still travel with my DS, like, or my analog pocket. Like, I never take my Switch out of the house, even though it's ostensibly a portable console. It's like, if I'm going on an overnight trip with my family, like, I'm bringing my DS or my Game Boy or my analog pocket with me, the same as I did 20 years ago, which I do think says something about the way that sort of handheld gaming, like dedicated handheld gaming devices, have, you know, changed over time. I think they're coming back into style. Like, we're seeing a lot more of these like clone systems that you know, are like software emulation driven, or something like the analog pocket that's hardware emulation driven. But even the Steam Deck, like, it is clunky and it's not a great device for taking out of the house either, but people are starting to gravitate more towards that again. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how the next 5 years goes in terms of maybe creating better catered experiences for dedicated gaming, because a lot of us, I think, want to get off our phones, and that's a big part of the reason I bring my analog pocket with me. So if I'm on the ferry, I'm not sitting for an hour and a half looking at my phone. I'll pull out my, you know, my analog pocket and play Dragon Quest, and that just feels like a better use of my time. And I think more and more people are starting to feel that.
I can very much relate to that. I was actually talking to a coworker about how I'm tired of being chronically online, especially with, not to get political, but with the current election cycle and how crazy it's been. Like, just as a little timestamp for listeners, we're recording this a couple days out from the American election. Now, Aidan, I know you're Canadian, but unfortunately, all the shit that we do here seems to bleed into your country too. So I apologize for that.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, Canadians are following so closely, and we, you know, you go on Blue Sky and we're all talking about the U.S. election, or we have opinions, and it's like, it's unavoidable, right? It's like, you know, when I was traveling through Europe, I remember being on a train, and there was I was on a train car, and half of it was non-smoking and half of it was a smoking section, and it was divided by a layer, like a plexiglass sheet, but there was about 6 inches above and below the plexiglass where it didn't connect flushly with the roof or the floor, and so that just completely defeated the point of having a non-smoking and smoking section. And that's sort of like what it feels like with American politics. We can't get away with it, or away from it, and we have no stakes. We have no ability to, you know, have any sway over what happens. But what happens in Canada doesn't really impact the United States. What happens in the United States impacts Canada immensely. And so, you know, I feel you there. It's like, you know, we just had a provincial election, which was very tight, and now this US election's coming up, and I'm purposefully trying to, like, you know, be more thoughtful about how I use my time. And being very online is something that I've been for 25 years, and it's hard to break away from that, but it does have implications.
Yep.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I've been spending most of my time not online lately. You might see me on Discord. That's about it.
I don't blame you. Like I was saying, like, just to bring it back to the DS, that's why I kind of miss, like, an era like
chat.
this.
We got to get Picto chat.
Picto chat.
No.
It's funny too. I don't. This is probably anecdotal, but I've heard stuff online too about like Gen Zers and whatnot being like actually getting non-smartphones, quote unquote, because they don't want to be connected 24/7 type of thing. I don't know if that's true or not. I heard that.
I mean, my Alpha,
you know,
Gen kid doesn't want a phone. Like, she's told us, like, I don't want a phone. Like, she wants a dumb phone so that she can like text her friends. But, like, she's 10 and does not want a smartphone because she sees us on it all day and is like, you know, get off your phone, guys. Like, well, what are you doing? So I think there is probably some water to that. I bought a dumb phone about 6 months ago, 8 months ago. and really liked it. But it's impossible to navigate this world without a smartphone these days, and that didn't exist.
Yeah.
20 years ago when the Nintendo DS was coming out, we didn't have to be connected with everything, so we could carry a device that only did one thing for us. It didn't have to, pay for our movie tickets. It didn't have to connect us, like to our bus system or, our transit passes and all that kind of stuff. Because that was covered by real world tools that worked
And
independently and just did the one thing that they were good at. And, we miss that in the modern world, I think.
And the people that you were able to connect with it via PictoChat, to bring that back into it, it was all people who had a DS. So you all were kind of at least in some semblance of a shared ground. But let's go into this a little bit further now. Let's go back to 2002. The system began development in 2002, and it was officially announced in 2004. And allegedly, the idea of the system actually came from the then Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi before Satoru Iwata took the reins of the company, before Hiroshi or Mr. Yamauchi stepped down. They called it the third pillar, like I said at the intro, because they didn't want it to seem like, oh, we're dropping the Game Boy brand and here we are with this new thing. We're getting rid of Game Boy for this new system called the DS. No, they were trying to create not make it seem like they're replacing anything. It's just going to be three pillars of their business model: the Game Boy line, the home console line, and then this DS system, right? And what is it? I was watching a Scott the Woz video, and he brought up a good point. Like, what do you mean you weren't planning on replacing the Game Boy line? You put a GBA slot in this thing. Like, what? That seems like contradictory.
Yeah, I mean, the GBA came out in 2001, right? Like, the Game Boy Advance wasn't even old at that point, so it was
that is nuts to think about.
And like, the third pillar thing is weird in hindsight, but I can kind of see how they were looking probably at the Game Boy Advance as sort of the core, like, make it super cheap, $99, make it $69 and get it into the hands of kids. There's this huge cheap library of games. And then the DS is something that's more experimental, maybe something that older people might buy into as a novelty, sort of similar to what the Virtual Boy was, right? Like, Nintendo had been doing that and releasing sort of strange, like, consoles and devices going back to the NES, and I can see how they were sort of like, oh, this is kind of fun, we're experimenting in a new space, maybe there's something here 5 years from now. But then it just took off in a way I think maybe Nintendo didn't even necessarily recognize.
It's really funny because when the DS came out, I was still in like elementary school, so I was surrounded by like incredibly young kids like at the time, and we all legitimately called it the Game Boy DS. Like, it just didn't, like, it was just the next Game Boy, and no one really thought of it as this new thing. So it's kind of interesting they were trying to like maybe hold on to the Game Boy branding just in case.
That's pretty much what it was. They didn't know if it was going to succeed or not. And remember, Nintendo in 2002 was floundering. In every subsequent console after the NES, though the Super Nintendo did well, but every subsequent console after the NES saw less and less sales. I mean, if you look at it, the NES obviously had it was like 80% market share or some shit like that. Like, it was insane.
Oh, yeah.
And then the Super Nintendo sold well, obviously, but it did decrease mainly from the fact that obviously they lost some of the market share to Sega.
They actually had competition.
They actually had competition. And then when the N64 comes out, Sony, the juggernaut that Sony was, came onto the scene. And like, if you look at like the sales just on that, PS1 sold over 100 million units and the N64 sold 32. Like, while the N64 was not necessarily a failure per se, it also was not a success by any stretch of the imagination, because the Super Nintendo sold 49 and then the NES sold 61 million units.
And then think about the GameCube. I know.
And then you have the GameCube, which sold even less than the N64, sold approximately 21 million, almost 22.
It hurts Nintendo fans to say this, but the GameCube was kind of a failure when you really think about it.
In the grand, like GameCube is, and it's not a bad system. Obviously, we all love it, but it's for different things. But like, yeah, if you look at Nintendo in 2002 and 2003, they were floundering. They were losing market share rapidly, and they didn't quite know what to do. The only thing that was keeping them somewhat afloat was their handheld market. You know, the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, which it is kind of weird to think about. Like, as much as the Game Boy Advance was out in 2001, like you mentioned, Aidan, it would go on to actually sell 81 million units, which is not no like that's nothing to sneeze at. That is those are great numbers. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color ended up selling 120 million, 119ish million units, a little bit less than that. And even in 2001 and 2002, the Game Boy still had games coming out for it. I mean, obviously, it was not what it was just 5 years prior with like Pokemon and stuff like that, but like it was still selling well. So like Nintendo had at least a little market share, but it was their home consoles that were floundering. And what I think is interesting about the DS, I'm sure the Wii was in development before around the same time as the DS was as well, if not shortly after or right at the same time. Um, the DS was Nintendo's first attempt, and Iwata kind of championed this, of trying to attract the casual gamer. And you know, they did that with the Wii as well, and you can see because it worked for both the systems. The Wii sold 101 million units, and the DS family system is the second best selling system of all time. Between the DS, DS Lite, and DSi, it sold 154 million units, just less than a million shy of the PS2. Like that's insane.
It's actually funny when you think about it because the DS is technically part of the seventh generation of video games. If you actually think about it, that has got to be one of the most dominating performances from a company ever because the Wii was the best selling console of that generation, and then the DS is literally one of the greatest selling video game systems, period. Nintendo kind of destroyed the seventh generation when you really think about it.
And they were cooking, and I think that they like really capitalized on what they learned with the Game Boy originally, right? And they went into the market with the Game Boy with an underpowered but accessible device. And anytime they tried to get away from that after the Super Nintendo, they started to flounder, like when they kind of chased the market lead against, you know, like the most powerful system or going into 3D, competing against the PlayStation. You know, with the GameCube again, trying to like compete on power rather than accessibility, they always fell back. And every time they've kind of led with that Game Boy mentality of like, you know, we won't be the most powerful out there, but we'll be the one that you have with you. We'll be the one that's in your living room. They've always just crushed it. And so I'm so curious to see where they go with the Switch 2, because that's what led to the Switch's major success as well, is sort of accessibility, and that Game Boy mentality of like, just focus on great games. We're not going to beat everybody at tech. We're going to beat them by having the best games that people actually have in their living room or in their backpack.
They also needed that monumental wake-up call that was the Wii U.
Yeah. It's because the Wii U is its own. I mean, can you believe that system's over a decade now? Old now. That's
the Wii U is like a prototype of the Switch, right? Like it was sort of like, you know, like in hindsight, that's what it was. It was like they had this idea and they didn't really quite know where to get to with it. And I think the DS could have been that too. It felt like a prototype. It felt like a prototype from the moment they debuted it on stage, and it looked like it was made out of plasticine. You know, like it looked like a mold that some, you know, designer had like whipped up in 2 seconds. Like the plastic looked funky. It looked like a prototype. It looked like it was like, okay, here's this idea we have. Like, we're not super confident in it, but seems like it could be fun. And the Wii U did that same thing. It was like, okay, we feel like a dedicated, you know, like semi-portable experience. People can play their home console while someone else is watching a movie. Like, there's something there. They just didn't really execute on it the first time around, but they nailed it the next time around. And I think that, like, you know, if Nintendo can continue to like learn that lesson going forward and apply that lesson, you know, I think we're in for something great with the Switch 2. But if they don't, if they're just going to try to make like Switch 2, you know, Electric Boogaloo and it's just harder or like, like more powerful, like, it's going to be that Wii U situation of like, well, like what is propelling me to buy this over the original Switch, except that the original Switch feels like it's falling apart at this point. Whereas, like, I
I will
don't think that
say
was necessarily the same case with some of the other Nintendo consoles by the end of the lifespan.
I will say though they also do have the benefit of Sony and Microsoft not having any idea what the hell they're doing right now.
That's very true.
Yes,
That's very
I mean,
true.
console gaming is just in a strange spot, right? Like Nintendo still does feel like it has the strongest identity in terms of like leading the console gaming space, despite the fact that their tech is so far behind everybody else's. It feels like Microsoft is about ready to just sort of like leave the party early and hope nobody notices. And Sony, like the PlayStation Pro announcement didn't go well, right? And so like you're seeing that there's like the appetite for what people are looking for is like it's not just like slightly better ambient occlusion in your games. Like that's not what people are looking for. And I wonder how Nintendo's looking at the PS Pro announcement and saying, "Oh, hey, we need to reposition the Switch 2 because of what we saw from Sony."
Well,
and go for it. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Aidan, you brought up a point earlier that hit the nail on the head with how this whole thing with Nintendo's with that hit the. You brought up a point earlier that kind of hit the. You brought up a point earlier that kind of hit the nail on the head with this whole conversation we're having. What the DS actually did and how it's kind of affected Nintendo ever since is that they are constantly trying to find new ways for you to play. It's not just simply, coming up with a new genre or trying out or trying a different way, like a different coat of paint on a similar genre or similar game style or anything like that. Their systems since the DS, and the DS was very much the trial run for it, like you mentioned, and so much so that Yamauchi was quoted saying, "If the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell." That is a quote from Yamauchi.
That is like that's a Babe Ruth level, like calling your shot. Hey,
right?
Yamauchi was like one of like he did not care. He would say whatever was on his mind, and I really respect a lot of what he had to say.
He's an interesting figure, for sure. But he was. It's weird how prescient it was because it's like every system since the Switch, or excuse me, that's not the Switch, the DS has tried to reinvent how people play games. The DS with the touchscreens, the Switch, or excuse me, the Wii with obviously motion controls, the Wii U with being out like the only system that I'm aware of that allows you to have 5 players playing at once type of thing. Then the 3DS obviously was basically just a DS, but they added a lot more like network features and a whole bunch of other stuff to it. And then the Switch. And they've tried to keep that mentality going forward. And you really see it with the DS. They really try to find a different way for people to play games. And what I love about it, what I truly love about the DS is that while it started off with that, we're going to appeal to the casual gamer audience, and it worked. That was the direction they went, and it worked. It is arguably a better implementation of that design philosophy than what the Wii was. Don't get me wrong, the Wii sold really well, and to even take out the system numbers, like I know the DS sold better than the Wii, but if you take that out, if you wanted to have like a classic quote unquote hardcore gaming style experience, like you had a better chance of doing that on the DS than you did with the Wii because of the lack of motion controls. Like on a DS, you could just play with a D-pad and buttons, and like, yeah, you might not be able to do an FPS per se, but there you could have like a basic ass like platformer on there, and it would still feel like you remember playing on the NES. And while you did have that stuff on the Wii, don't get me wrong, there was a lot of stuff, New Super Mario Brothers and all that stuff. You still had that extra level of like challenge of trying to design for it because of the motion control, because holding the Wiimote sideways wasn't the most comfortable thing, or if you had to hold it straight on, it's hard to control games like that between holding the little dongle on the side, and like it was a completely different control scheme that maybe you were used to. The DS still had that classic gaming control scheme, and you had the ability to do a quote unquote classic hardcore gaming experience. But then you would also have games like Nintendogs, Brain Age, Elite Beat Agents, stuff that would appeal to a more casual audience with, rhythm games and brain teaser games and puzzle games. But what I loved about that too is that they took those ideas, and then you get games that are like, let's see what we can we design a game around this interface that would appeal to hardcore gamers. And you get games like The World Ends With You, which is very much a DS game. Like, you need to play with a touchpad to kind of get the whole feel of that game. And that game's not meant to appeal to a broad audience, but it still utilized the features of the DS in a way that was like new and interesting, and it made an entirely new style of gameplay in an RPG that you would never have experienced before. And that's what I think I love so much about this system, is that it was able to take that edict from Iwata of appealing to the casual gamers, and the ethos, that's the word I was trying to think of earlier. And then they were able to modify it and do things that were interesting that appealed to hardcore gamers as well.
I think like one of the really interesting things about the Nintendo DS like development environment is, like, you bring up The World Ends With You, you bring up Elite Beat Agents. It was affordable and cheap to develop for the Nintendo DS, especially compared to console games at the time. And so that inspired, more creative risk taking, because there was less, like consequence. If something like The World Ends With You fails, the cost of it and the team size and the development time is relatively short compared to, like, the big PS2 games that were coming out at that point. And I think that created an environment where we saw just a really strong catalyst for creativity and risk taking and unique games that we kind of started to lose again as we left the DS era and went back into the 3DS. Like, as that started to launch, like, you look at the 3DS library and it's a lot more traditional, right? Like, it feels like a bunch of PS2 and GameCube games on a handheld, whereas the DS really has its own identity in a way that I don't think any other handheld console has, unless you start looking at like the Playdate, right? Like, to find something that has as strong of an identity as the DS, like, you have to go and look at stuff like that, because it was just such a perfect coming together of, like, affordability and creative risk taking environment that allowed developers to make games in a way that resembled maybe like the early 90s on consoles, where you had small teams able to just not get pulled down by quarterly results or whatever. And I think that impacted maybe the console games a little bit more. And so I just I look through my library of DS games, and there's just so much there that I just feel like you'd never see on a handheld console anymore.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
Like,
were you going to say something, Bill?
I was going to say, like, the DS to me is like one of the last consoles out there where, like, the library is just like, it's got one of the deepest, like, crazy libraries ever. Like, anytime I go out, like, retro collecting or like to a convention, I will see DS games I didn't even know existed. And a lot of them are fascinating. Like, there is like crazy ideas that were going on at this time. Like, I mean, the Trauma Center series was like a big one I always think of. Dementium the Ward, like, it's another crazy
which actually just recently got a re-release.
Oh, did it?
Let me find it while you're talking. But one of the designers on it, Jules Ward, I'll double check. It recently got a re-release. I'll look it up though. Jules Washam. I'll look it up though.
There's also a lot of really interesting, like, quirky games, like we had mentioned before. Field of Magic, an interesting Sonic Team game, also known as Project Rub to people in Europe, and even some really obscure RPGs. Like, I always remember, like, Contact is one that, like,
Contact's great, yeah.
Like, that game for me, like, that is one of my biggest, like, collecting regrets, because I picked that game up when it was stupidly expensive. And now it's like down to like $40, and I'm just like, God damn it!
I have a few DS games on my desk here that I pulled out before recording, and like, I have Ni no Kuni, like an entire version of Ni no Kuni, which like I know from playing on my PlayStation.
Did you import
3. That? I imported it. Yeah, I can't even remember where I bought it, but It's an entire version of Ni no Kuni on the DS. And then I have Ash, Archaic Sealed Heat, which is a Mistwalker game, which is just like one of the most interesting, unique, and sometimes ugly and sometimes strange games that takes a fairly familiar idea like this, the strategy games that Square Enix was sort of famous for, and Sakaguchi with Mistwalker went and built something that was just tried things and experimented and pushed boundaries. And so in the United States or the Canada or the West, we got a ton of games, but as soon as you start dipping your toes into the stuff that just came out domestically in Japan, it just explodes in terms of what sort of is out there. That I just like Bill says, I can go and look at a bunch of games on eBay or on at a flea sale and just like flea market, and I just didn't even know they existed, right? And I can't say that about a lot of modern games. Like I feel like I know pretty much everything that exists on the Switch or the PlayStation 5. But it's endlessly fascinating to look back at what people were trying. And you could make a game and release it in Japan and it would be fine, because it didn't need to sell 3 million units. It could sell 80,000 units and be a success.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why people are not, you can really see the not to constantly compare it to modern day, but I guess really what's interesting about the DS is that it is the perfect like polar opposite of what we're experiencing right now for the most AAA development, most AAA developers. Every game has to be, that, I mean, it's a tired talking point. You see every podcaster and game commenter talk about it, but there's truth to it. Like every game that's released by the big studios have to be capital underline AAA, like huge experience that costs millions upon millions upon billions or however many billions of dollars to make. So it has to sell insane amounts of money or insane amounts of numbers just to break even. And you're not seeing these AA or AAA experiences anymore, and that it's a real damn shame, because that's where a lot of the creativity that then allows you to have those giant AAA games later on, because you can expand a AA idea, take it out. And the DS feels like that was like one of if not the last bastions for this type of design. And now real quick, you were saying before, Bill, Dementium, right? Or Dementium, or however you say it, that did get an official re-release on Switch. You can pick it up. Jules Watchum at Jules Watchum on Twitter. Yeah, I apologize. I hate that website now, but that's the only place that I know where he's at. He also is part of a company called Atoi LLC, ATOOI. They made Dementium. They also recently have a game called Hatch Tales, which looks like an adorable little like a side-scrolling platformer type of game, like adventure platformer. It looks kind of cool. Yeah. So real quick before we also continue on, we started off with just talking about, the system was announced in 2004 and this and that. Let's go over some other talking points about the world of gaming at the time the DS came out, right? So after the DS was announced in early 2004, and obviously it came out later on that year, there was something else announced that year, and it was the PlayStation Portable. And I'm getting this info from Retronauts. I didn't really see it, do any research on the news articles, but from my understanding, based off what Retronauts talked about, people thought the DS was going to fail horribly, because at that time, and it was not like an unrealistic thing to consider, Sony was eating everybody's lunches. They were the bully. They were just eating everyone's lunches. And Nintendo, their last bastion was the handheld market, and then Sony's like, nah fam, we got one for you. And it was more powerful than the DS. It was going to be able to play movies and listen to music, and this was obviously before smartphones, which would make a lot of that obsolete. But this system was going to be the killer of Nintendo. People thought this was going to put the final nail in Nintendo's coffin, because it just on paper it looked like it was going to succeed by leaps and bounds. So it just makes it that much more interesting to see what Nintendo, like Yamaushi's quote, hits that much more like emotionally, it hits the Yamauchi's quote hits that much harder when you think about it in that context, where not only was Nintendo doing poorly in general, but also now Sony was like, hey, we're joining your market too. Good luck, Nintendo. We just destroyed you in the last 2 generations, and it wasn't even close. What are you going to do about this one?
Yeah, the PSP is one of the most fascinating things in gaming because it by all intents and purposes, like, it was brought up as like it was going to be the next greatest thing ever, and it,
Mm-hmm.
for all intents and purposes, didn't fail, but it was not quite what they expected it to be.
Yep.
I mean, I think you touched on something interesting, Josh, that the PSP, a lot of what it was offering was, listening to music, was access to like all of these multimedia things, UMD movies and stuff like that. Came out in 2005, and that was sort of unique. And then the iPhone arrived in 2007, and I don't think you can discount the impact that that had on what the PSP was offering in the market, because all of a sudden there was a device that did all of those things better.
Mm-hmm.
So all the PSP then had to rely on was its game. So then it was competing with, the DS 1-to-1. And Nintendo had been marketing and developing the DS from the get-go, and all of their handhelds before that as gaming first devices. And so once the PSP sort of lost that, that market competitive angle of multimedia use, it didn't really have the weight behind it as a pure gaming device to really compete against the Nintendo DS. And Sony, I mean, I love the PSP. I think it's a fantastic system, and there's so many great unique standalone games. The fact that it could play the PlayStation games means you have access to all of these wonderful titles. But it just didn't really get the support, I think, that it really needed to separate itself. And again, it was just trying to do that whole like, hey, it's a PlayStation 2 in your pocket, instead of trying to like really hone in on what makes portable gaming unique. And so many games on the DS thought about how people play games on the go with a handheld device, how that different than the way that they play console games. And the PSP didn't do that. It had some fantastic pick up and play games. It had Luminous, it had like lots of stuff like that. Sound Shapes was cool, but it just like didn't really hone in on that as part of its identity. And I think that once the iPhone arrived, a lot of people started carrying that around as their way to listen to music or podcasts. I know I did. I listened to podcasts. I listened to One Up Yours on my PSP for a while. But then as soon as I got an iPod Touch that could do that, I stopped using my PSP for anything multimedia related. And then it would be, if I was going out, I had my Nintendo DS and I had my and then I had my iPod Touch, and I could do everything that I wanted to. And I didn't really need to bring my PSP with me.
I think you're right there, Aiden. I always knew like the release of the iPhone and smartphones did affect it. Not only affected the PSP, it also did affect the DS, but not nearly as like it was detrimental to the DS, but nowhere near to the effect of the PSP. And I never really thought about it this way, in that like Sony really was trying to do that all-in-one thing, which I think now, I hope console manufacturers realize like all-in-one as the focus, as opposed to like a side, as opposed to like a bonus aspect of a system, is how you fail a system. Look at the Xbox One. But yeah, but we'll get off that where this is a DS episode. But I think that makes a really interesting point, in that when the multimedia aspect of it fell off and the bottom of it came out, all they had left was the games. And the way that Sony marketed their games was like, here, do you want to play Little Big Planet on the go? Here's the same game, but a crappier version of it. I shouldn't say crappier, but less fidelity, a little less intuitive, because you don't have like dual joysticks, and like you can't play it as easily. But here's an on the go version of it. And
very few DS games felt like a compromised version of something else, right? Like they all felt like their own unique, bespoke experiences. Like it's not until you got to the 3DS and you had things like Dragon Quest VIII that you went, oh, this is a kind of compromised but version of a game that I love, but I can play it on the go. But that was the PSP. Always felt that way to me.
I'd actually disagree a little bit, depending on the games, like, because I know for a fact, like, particular games like the God of War titles, those were like pretty notable for being surprisingly impressive on
No,
PSP.
there's good exclusive titles and original unique titles on the PSP, but you look at how it's kind of like the same issue like that you would end up having with like the Xbox One versus PS4. Console exclusives won PS4 that
Oh yeah.
generation, right? What exclusive like how many exclusives on the DS versus how many exclusives on the PSP? And while you had your Daxters, your Crisis Core, your Birth by Sleep, your like you already mentioned the God of War games. The, I can't think of many more outside of those. I'm sure there are some.
And like, I didn't play any of those because I didn't want to play those on the go. Like, I didn't want to play Jack and Daxter on the go. I wanted to play puzzle games because I had 5 minutes to pick up my PSP, right? I wanted to play Luminous, or I wanted to grind in an RPG while I was on the ferry. Like, I didn't want to play console style action games or platformers. So I never played Jack and Daxter on the PSP, or I wasn't interested in God of War games because I liked playing those at home on my TV, on my PlayStation 2. And so for me, that whole experience of like the PSP was, was looking for and trying to get, games that felt good to play on the go, and that I couldn't get that experience at home. The appeal of like console gaming on the go just wasn't there for me personally. And so a lot of the exclusives that you're bringing up were like, it felt like they didn't know how to, or not that they didn't know how to. I shouldn't I'm not trying to disparage the people who made these games. They are fun and I go back to them and I enjoy them, but it was developed from an angle that didn't match what I wanted from handheld gaming at that point, or now really for that matter.
Yeah, it's kind of like to each his own kind of thing. Like, because I've noticed the PSP is such a weird one to me because it's like the one legitimate competition I think Nintendo ever had.
Oh yeah,
when it came to a rival handheld, and it's kind of interesting that like the last point I want to make about it is like it's kind of been like retroactively like people will label it as a failure, but like the thing sold 82 million units. It's still like it sold more than the 3DS. Like that's always something that blows my mind.
Yeah, and I mean, I love my PSP. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours using it. I love my Vita that I only got last year, and I'm dipping back into it. And like those experiences are fun on their own. But I think at the specific time that the DS was competing against the PSP, it was like such a curious inflection point of what people were expecting from tech and gaming devices, and I think a lot of that comes back to the iPhone, and again the generation of kids who grew up in the 80s and were kids with the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo 64 kind of coming into adulthood and what they were looking for from gaming devices at that time. I don't think it was just kids getting it exclusively the way that older consoles and handhelds were. You had adults buying these for themselves at this point.
And it's funny you bring up the Vita, and I'm going to tie this back to the DS. I almost feel like the Vita, the thing that kills me about it is that it could have been Sony's DS, and what I mean by that is the Vita had a lot of different ways that you could interact with it, with the two different touchscreens, the back and front, and then the two dual joysticks, right? And I know a lot of people criticize the back touchscreen. Oh, that's so gimmicky. That's so bad. Play Tearaway. I'm begging people to play Tearaway. That game is so goddamn good. And it is a wonderful, charming game that used the back touchscreen in the best way the only way I've seen done well. And I'm not saying that developers should have shoehorned the back touchscreen into everything, but like it worked well in that game. And it's the same thing with the DS. Like the DS touchscreen could have been really gimmicky. There are games that do use it very gimmicky and it's not fun or intuitive. With that said, there's a fuckload of games that are amazing and use it great and use it exceptionally well. And I really feel like the Vita had the potential to do what the DS did, but what Sony did with the Vita, and it's the same thing that we did with the PSP, was that they focused on the wrong things and it killed the system too early. And well, to be fair, I feel like they barely focused on the Vita at all. They're just here it is.
They gave up after about a year. They were like, never mind.
But it's just heartbreaking, man. Now, we've been talking all about the history of the DS and like what the gaming landscape was like when the system came out. Let's talk about the system, like literally the system itself, like what was on the system. Well, you had two screens, like we've mentioned before. It also had a microphone. It also had basically the buttons were basically a Super Nintendo style controller, so you're already kind of used to that if you played Super Nintendo. The original DS had a thing called PictoChat, which we've joked around. It was like little chat rooms that you could go into, and but it was local. It was not online. You could then, if there was people within like 80 or 100 feet of you or something like that, maybe 180, 100 yards. I don't know. Probably 80 to 100 feet. Yards would be insane. You could then chat with each other if you joined into a room, which I lived in the suburbs, so, and not in like a development type of thing. So there was nobody there to chat with me ever. I don't think I've ever been in a PictoChat chat room that wasn't when I was already with friends in person. Which, why would you then just do that except just to be weird, or just to goof around in and send, like, draw dicks to send to each other? I don't know.
Gosh, how did you get on my school bus back in middle school?
uh, traveled all the way up to wherever you were. So yeah, like the obviously it was a clamshell design. You could flip it closed, which was awesome because that could also automatically pause the software, which was great. You could just close it, and then if you would open it up, it would just pick literally right back up where you went, or where you left off at. It was awesome. And as there was different versions of the DS, the DSi or the DS Lite came out a little bit later on, and it was a thinner version of it, better screen, better backlit screen, that's for damn sure. And all around, it's kind of like where the system kind of took off, and then they decided to make the DSi, which was kind of like really catching that whole iPhone mentality with it, adding a camera to it. Everything was something in the late aughts, iCarly was a thing. And yeah, like I'll go into some more stuff with the DSi a little bit later on, but that's pretty much like the physical hardware of it. There was also a lot of cool extra things you could do with the system. Did either of you guys play with the multiplayer, like via the downloads from local? If a friend had a DS and you had a DS and they brought a game, did you ever do the multiplayer by downloading from their cartridge?
I did. We had many a day where I was the only person who had Mario Kart DS, and it would give you like this very basic multiplayer where like if you could get like 3 other people to join you, and you could play like, I think it was like maybe like like one track from each cup, I think, but it was like it was just cool to do, like with no wires or no additional cartridges.
I did that on GBA, I think, with Mario Kart. You could, like, if you linked up your GBAs, you could do it, but it wasn't. Again, it was quite limited. But I remember one road trip playing with some friends, Mario Kart in the back, going snowboarding.
What was really cool. What was really cool though is if you had, say, like, I use Mario Kart as an example because it was like kind of the one that we did this with the most. If you happen to get one other person that had the game, it would automatically give you like everything, and then anyone, you could get 2 other people to join, and then they could just hop on to like off the full game experience as long as 2 people had the game. It was really cool.
I love that Nintendo does shit like that, man. I think it's so cool that they have ways where you can play with other people without everyone having to buy a copy of the game. Because Mario Kart was also not the only one to do it. I actually played Mario Party with friends. And what was cool, like you mentioned, Aidan, you did it with the Game Boy Advance, but you needed the link cable for that still.
Yeah, that's right.
For the DS, it was all wireless, excuse me. You could just all sit in the living room, not have to be huddled up right next to each other. And you could just play Mario Party and stuff like that. Really, really cool just thing.
And then outward from that it was my first experience sort of like being part of an online community, playing a game. Like I remember playing being online, playing Pokemon Black and White, I think. and
Mhm.
being really into like eggs, like training eggs in that game and trading them and trading Pokemon and stuff, and just being on like a forum and connecting with people who wanted this Pokemon or that Pokemon, sending friend codes and all that kind of stuff. I even had a little headset so I could chat with them, and like that's not something I ever did before. It's not something I do now, but the DS sort of like had that communal feeling of like, hey, like let's get together and make this something that isn't just like something you do by yourself, but it's something that extends to like people in all of your communities, the ones that are with you in the room, the ones that are sort of around the world as well.
The wireless was also like one of the first betrayals I had ever had in middle school, where we were trading Pokemon using the wireless, and I traded my Pokemon over, and then the kid ran away.
Oh no!
And I was like, that was after that. I was like, never again.
You poor soul. You
It
poor
also just
soul.
the device also just like implemented cool like gimmicky things that stand out to me, like in Trace Memory and Phantom Hourglass, like closing the lid of the DS to like stamp, to transfer a stamp or something like that. Stuff like that was really cool. Like, and I played through the Trace Memory remake on Switch, and I never played it on DS. But you could just tell that something was missing in all the puzzles. Like all the puzzles in the Switch version had to be controller accessible,
Yeah.
and so like they all just
Mhm.
felt like generic puzzles, and I'd go back and I'd look at how they did it on the DS, and it was always something like sort of unique, like having to figure out that you actually need to like transfer something by closing the DS. And there was another game I've been googling it, I cannot figure out what it was. I feel like it was like a Looney Tunes game or something, but to get through one puzzle you had to like close the lid. The game didn't go to sleep, but then you use the L and R buttons on top to like control your way through a puzzle using just sound. And you just can't see that. Like that stuff just doesn't really exist necessarily anymore in modern games, because physical hardware just doesn't exist in the same way as the DS. And there was just that level of kind of creative exploration of game design that I would, we see it in different ways now. It's not like there aren't creative game designers out there, especially in the indie space, but to see it in like, utilized in ways that I'd never thought of before was just really stands out and continues to stand out for me as such a fun time to be into video games.
I don't know if I was the only person that did this or not, but I have to know. Like, so we had mentioned like the closing the lid would shut the game off. Certain games they programmed little sound effects whenever you'd open and close the lid, and
Mhm.
I remember Mario 64 in particular. Like when you would open the lid, it would go like, "It's a me, Mario," and when you would shut it, it would go, "Bye bye." I'm pretty sure as a child I spent a good half an hour just opening and closing the damn thing.
Oh yeah, just spamming those sound effects. That sounds like something I would have done as a kid too.
Just because it was so fascinating. You'd be like, bye bye, and he'd open it up and he'd be like, "It's a me," and you just keep going back and forth.
You want to talk about Nintendo still doing shit like that. I have the Lego Marios, and if you pull his pants off, he goes, "Oh no." I'm dead serious.
That's
That's not a
wonderful.
joke. I mean, I'm
Amazing.
saying it to make people laugh, but like that's actually true. If you turn the Lego Mario on and you pull, because you have to, like, in order to put batteries in him, his overalls come off, and then that's where the screw to open up the battery back part is. So when when I took it off one time to to make sure I screwed it in, I forgot that like I left it on, and so he goes, "Oh no!" I'm like, "Wow, they even did that. Like they can tell when you take his pants off. That's weird, but okay."
I think like, we're also very fondly talking about all of the innovation and stuff. I think there were lots of examples where it didn't really work or created like worst game
Oh yeah,
experiences. Like, I think of WarioWare or Rhythm Heaven, and like the Game Boy versions of those to me were just better because the button inputs were much more precise. There wasn't lag, there wasn't any like lack of clarity about whether you'd done the motion correctly or not. And so we would see experimentation that like I think we learned something from a game design perspective, but also learn the limitations of what touch controls can do. Like did anybody like touch controls in Phantom Hourglass? Like that was something that like was just unnecessarily capitalizing on
I
a
kind of like
feature
them.
that existed. Really? That they were like,
Yeah,
it was so imprecise and like I just
No,
want
I had
I
a good
don't
time with
interesting.
it.
Okay.
See,
But like it more so than traditional controls because they weren't doing anything new. They were just emulating traditional
I
controls through touch controls. And that to me is
don't
where
know.
you like if you're going to replace something with something different, like it needs to offer improvement. And I felt like Phantom Hourglass would have played as well or better with just traditional controller based controls.
I will say what one part of that game that did make me mad was there's a point in the game where you go to a vendor and he's like, I want to hear you yell so
oh,
that way you can.
I was
So
about to
that,
bring up the microphone.
yeah, so that you need to yell into the microphone. I want to hear you cheer for sales,
Were you on a
like
school
for a
bus too?
sale. And I'm like, when I was playing it, I was on I was on a flight.
Oh,
I'm like,
even better.
well, I can't do that. So what I did do was I had the DS in my hand. I just put my finger over the microphone and I just like rubbed it back and forth really fast. So that way it would like the microphone would pick up all the static and everything.
Oh,
And it worked really well. And then I got a good deal, and the guy's like, "Good job." You could have. I forget what he tells you to do. He's like, "You could have just like tapped the microphone. You would look really silly if you just started yelling. I would hate to see if you were in public." And I was reading this while on a plane, and I'm just like, "You motherfucker!" I was so mad.
my tactic back in the day, it probably wouldn't work nowadays just because of events that have happened within the last few years. But I used to like if it was like one of the ones where you couldn't get away with like because I know some games like you tried to do like the tap thing or like the blow into it thing and it wouldn't work.
That's what it was. He suggested blowing into it.
I know I used to do the thing where I'd like do like a one of those like obnoxious like fake coughs, and it would just nowadays probably not the most best way to do that, but I would just kind of be like and it would work.
Unless you really need some personal space and you're on an airplane, then it might be an okay option.
Yeah, I always to me like the one game that got me like the worst with that was actually Ace Attorney Justice for All because the final screen in the game you have to usually you can yell objection as a bonus thing, but the one of the last screens in the game it makes you actually yell it into the thing. You can't blow it into it. You can't like tap it. You have to actually give it a good sound effect. And I was in class and I was like, I can't beat Ace Attorney right now. So I had to shut my DS and I just sat there and I was like, well, now I can't play any games. What do I do?
You gotta learn, man. You gotta learn.
Well, I had
I
already
feel
finished my test and were letting us just do whatever. So it was kind of
I mean, I
awkward.
feel like ultimately too, like it has led us now to just a place where we have better accessibility, right? To avoid all of this stuff. Because we talk about, like the inconvenience of being in public and having to yell into your DS or whatever. But then, you have people who can't do that, right? Just period. Or you have, like touch controls that are impossible for people to use. And in Astrobot, they have which recently came out on PlayStation 5. They have a few instances where there are some fans, you have to blow on your controller. I was sick with a cough like a month ago, and I could not do it without coughing up my lungs. But deep in the accessibility menu, there's an option to just bypass that stuff. And I think that like recognizing that like, experimentation also pushes limits of, what's accessible to people was an important
Mhm.
part of the DS and how we've learned to design better games so that everybody can play them.
I always like tried to imagine like for like one of the games that would on the DS would be like blow into the mic. I always imagine being in public and just like the people who like aren't gamers just looking at you like, what is he doing? Like,
Oh, it makes me smile so much.
Now
Um,
everybody
I do.
walks around like
Oh, go
zombies
ahead.
staring at little gaming devices, right? Like everybody's looking at their
yeah.
phone, talking into their phone. Like I feel like it's almost like more acceptable now or easier to get away with than it was pre iPhone.
Oh, absolutely. Gaming, especially because as gaming has become more of an accepted hobby for adults, even. But real quick, I have some other fun facts I want to just kind of go into really fast, and then we can continue on with the conversation. The DS was, contrary to popular belief, was not called the DS because of dual screen. It actually stood for Developers System, and the idea of it was it was to give game creators brand new tools which will lead to more innovative games for the world's players. That was kind of like Iwata's philosophy behind the idea of the DS being a developers system. And honestly, I kind of agree with him on that. Like it really, like there I mean, obviously it didn't create a whole lot of individual, not a whole lot of new IPs per se, excuse me, came out of this, but there was a whole lot of innovation within existing IPs. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely a lot of new IPs that came on it, but I'm just trying to think of, is there any like iconic series that came out of the DS? Ace Attorney, which
Well,
was a
that's
Game Boy Advance.
technically, I was going to say Professor Layton.
Professor Layton, yes. Oh my
is
god,
a good one. Yep.
yeah. Advance Wars, even though I know that was GBA at first, it continued on the DS, but like Professor Layton specifically, I'm glad I caught myself before that could have been bad. Also, it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's as popular as the Ace Attorney ones. Like I said, I know Ace Attorney started on the GBA, but it first came over to North America on the DS, so I'm kind of like grandfathering it in almost. What is it? The 999 games, 9 hours, 9 days, nine doors, 9 hours, 9 days.
The Double Escape series, or
the No Escape series.
Zero Escape, I think it's
Zero
called.
Escape. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's definitely not as iconic as Professor Layton, but it is on there. Also, I was about to go into something else. We'll get into it when we start talking about games.
I did think of one that's kind of true. New Super Mario Bros.
Oh, that's
kind of a series now.
It broke onto main consoles after that too. That's very true. The earliest model of the DS was codenamed Iris, and the original DS emulation software was called Insata, which is a type of flower, the Insata Iris. So it kind of tied in with the original DS model name. They also considered naming it Nitro. That was going to be the name for the Nintendo Nitro, I guess. Thank God they didn't. I don't think, as weird as DS is, I feel like Nitro would have been cheesier. Like, I don't know. Do you guys could prefer Nitro to DS or DS to Nitro?
You're telling me in an alternate universe we could have had the Nintendo Dolphin, the Nintendo Nitro, and the Nintendo Revolution?
I like Nintendo Nitro Youth Energy, little Offspring throwback.
Crazy Taxi Time.
Something that I will. Something I'll touch on here. I don't know enough about this. If either of you guys know about this a little bit more, we can go into it. But it was a piracy machine. One of the reasons of the DS's downfall wasn't just the fact that it got older and people lost interest in it. It's also because it was so easy to pirate games on the DS. What is it? Those like R4 cards or whatever it was. It was basically just it was a card that you could store hundreds and hundreds of game ROMs on, and it made it super easy to pirate games. And Nintendo tried different ways around it, but like the pirates were just able to get it was one of the biggest issue. The DS, I can honestly say, how a lot of game devs, and unfortunately we saw it with the Video Game History Foundation somewhat recently with like their failed attempt to allow libraries to like rent games and stuff like that. The argument always is, the emulation's just going to create piracy and stuff like that. As we all know, 9 times out of 10, piracy doesn't have a huge impact on the bottom line. It does, obviously, like a small amount, but it's not a huge impact. The DS, I actually think, was severely impacted by piracy to a point where, like, there was, I think they said it on Retronauts, that at one point Nintendo basically considered Europe and Brazil like just a dead market because there was no point in releasing games out there anymore because people just pirated them all.
It's interesting to me because I know nowadays like buying DS games is kind of sketchy because there's just so many fake ones out there online. It's interesting because when you first said piracy, for some reason I thought you meant emulation. I was actually thinking like I think the PSP was more of the emulation machine, but piracy, yeah, because I see those carts all the time and it's kind of insane.
Yeah. It's sad. I don't know too much more about it. I just know that it was a piracy machine. Like it was so easy for people to pirate the games, and it's a shame. Like normally, I'm not on the side of corporations. They make enough goddamn money as it is. But like, I don't blame Nintendo for being upset at this. If like it was so bad that it effectively killed an entire market area, like an entire region for you in terms of the market, like it. that sucks. And so I don't blame. But that was also towards the end of the DS's life cycle, so that's why I would probably like the 3DS had more protection and stuff on it and everything.
I
But
wonder if that's why the 3DS is the only region locked Nintendo handheld.
oh, maybe
I just kind of thought about that.
I could totally see that. I could totally see that. Aidan, do you have any thoughts on the piracy on the DS at all?
No, I mean, it was the first time, not the first time I became aware of like game piracy, but it definitely was the first time that it seemed to start seeping into conversation just in sort of like the online gaming space for me. But I was never really, I never pirated DS games. It came out at a time, like I said, I was like in my early 20s. I was, getting my first real, like working my first real job, still living at home with my parents. So I had a lot of disposable cash and I bought a lot of Nintendo DS games, new, but also used. Like we still had great, like used game stores. And so you could get great Nintendo DS games. Like I have a copy of Pokemon Gold, the remake. What's it? I can't remember what it's called.
Heart Gold.
Heart Gold. Came with the pedometer in box, everything. I got it for like $20 at like a video rental store used. And so like it was just this great era before like markups on used games really started to like skyrocket as they did sort of in later game generation console generations, where you get a very minimal discount on a game's full price. And so I hit up the bargain bins, and I never felt the need to pirate because Nintendo DS games are cheap. I had disposable income, and you could get some pretty sweet deals as long as you were willing to sort of like wait around a couple of weeks, couple of months, or just hit up those like bargain bins at video rental stores or electronic boutique or whatever. And it just like, I know that's not everybody's experience, but it was mine. And I have very fond memories of building out that DS collection far beyond like what I could keep up with playing.
That's how I got most of my DS games, honestly. Like, it's not as extreme as my Vita collecting days where I went on a cross-state road trip. Yeah. But not PSP, DS. I got so many of my games during that period where GameStop was just trying to get rid of them. Like,
yes,
you get like all the Pokemons for nothing. It's actually funny. I was when you were bringing that up, I actually brought up my Game Eye, and I was looking at my top 10 most valuable DS games, and out of the top 10, 6 of them are Pokemon games.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's mental.
Pokemon's wild because Nintendo refuses to like make the older ones accessible so that they can just, always focus on the next one. But like, it would be really nice if people could get a hold of Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, or, the GBA remakes of the originals. Cause like, I think those games still hold a lot of value, and I'm not surprised that they cost $400 now.
I still am, because they sold millions.
But nobody trades them in, right? Like, because I think so. People who want Pokemon games want to keep their Pokemon games. And the only way, like, I got mine at a video rental store, like when they were still renting DS games. And then once it stopped, like flying off the shelf, they'd put it off for sale for like peanuts. But yeah, Pokemon games are crazy.
I was actually going to say, bringing up piracy, like Pokemon Platinum is like one of the most common pirated games I see these days. Yeah. Like I've been to a few retro stores, and I've looked in and seen Platinum there, and I look at them like, oh, that's a pirated copy. I don't think they know.
No, I would never buy like a Pokemon game on the secondhand market for that reason, right? Like, because you're just so likely to get to a point where you just have a pirated copy, and it, if you know what you're looking for, that's fine. You can usually spot it, but I feel like most of them that I see listed online are pirated.
Yeah.
Piracy's a bitch, man. It's wild how rampant it was back on the DS. One final fun fact on the original DS itself. The DS was brought to the highest location on Earth. Mountain climbers Neil Mueller and Chris Grubb brought their DSs with them when they hiked Mount Everest. Mount Everest, excuse me. The crazy thing is, too, the system survived everything, the cold, the winds, and even there was curry that was spilled on them, and all their other electronics failed that they had brought had failed them going up the mountain, but the DSs were able to work even at the top of Mount Everest.
That's very on par for Nintendo. I mean, a Game Boy survived the goddamn Gulf War.
That doesn't surprise me.
it's a
If that
badge of honor for them.
if that charred Game Boy is still playing Tetris to this day, it doesn't surprise me that like any system could survive that.
um no, yeah, exactly. uh Real quick, I just want to go into, I was trying to find some more info for this, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the, unless you guys have fond memories of the DSi. I always found the DSi to be such an odd step up, because it was like, it was a DS with two cameras, but it also had it was the first time their handhelds could go online. Like, I mean, sorry, it wasn't online, but like there was a store. Like, you could buy
Mm.
DSiWare, and it had original software for the system, which is really cool. But other than that, it didn't really stick out to me. I'm sure the DSiWare had some interesting things to it, but for the most part, like it very much felt like the trial run for what would end up being the 3DS shop and the Wii U shop, and obviously the Wii shop was already going on at that point, the Wii E shop. Um, but I read a Iwata Asks article that he interviewed with the actual designers of the DSi hardware, and there's a couple interesting things I wanted to like just go into real quick with this. And if you guys have anything you want to comment on after I read all of it, by all means. The development for the DSi began in 2006. They talk about in the interview how it was actually really challenging to make the console, because from a marketing standpoint, they couldn't really rely on new games to come with it. I had never thought about that before. Like, you know, when you are selling the middle step in between a console generation, right? You know, you have your system and you have your PS5 and your PS5 Pro and whatnot. How do you market it to the public to make it worthwhile to them? Like, what can you really add that would actually be beneficial to the players? And they talk about how they couldn't rely on new games because, you know, the games were already part of the existing DS line. Like, that really wasn't going to work. So the first feature that they did decide on was the cameras. They considered having two different cameras for it, or not considered. They had two different cameras for it, and they also considered, though, having a swivel mechanism. So like, you could actually like take the top half of your DS, like the top screen, and like flip it around the other side, because they only were considering putting one camera on, and then that's when the swivel mechanism would come in. But they decided against it because it would have been it would have cost a lot to make. The system would have been bulkier, and most likely, you can imagine you have a handheld system with a swivel mechanism, that shit would have broken,
Oh yeah, like my original DS has a broken hinge, and I'm amazed that's the only thing that's broken about it.
right?
So,
The camera on it was a point 0.3 megapixel camera, which was capable of taking 640 by 480p resolution pictures, which sounds really bad. You know, zero point 0.3 megapixels is insane. That's 2.5 times the resolution of the DS screen.
mm.
So the reason they did that is because when you zoom in on a picture, they're not actually the reason it doesn't look bad on the DS is because you took it at 2 times the resolution of the DS screen.
Mm.
So it made zooming in a lot easier. Uh, the first time they presented the DSi, it flopped. When they presented it to the other department heads at Nintendo, it flopped, and they had to completely start over from scratch. Which is that's wild to me to think that that far along. If it's beginning development in 2006, and let me see, when did the DSi originally come out? 2008, November
Mm.
2008 in Japan. So it was they had to completely scrap it and go back to the drawing board. What was interesting was that the DSi originally planned to have two different game slots for DS games.
Hmm.
I don't know what purpose that would serve.
Well, I mean, if I'm thinking of other consoles that did this, and the only one I can think of is the Gamecom. So, yeah.
I just I don't I was it something where you could just like maybe, I mean, it would be kind of cool, but I don't know if how useful it would actually be, of like hot swapping back and forth between games. Like, you could pause like a state of a game and switch over to the other one. I don't know. I don't know
The,
what you would need that for, but I guess maybe that was a thought. I don't know.
the only idea I could think of is like maybe like with Pokemon, you trade with yourself. Like, I don't know.
Um, an excerpt that I have written down from Iwata asks, Masato Kuwahara, who was one of the leads, I think the lead of the development and engineering department at Nintendo at the time. He's quoted, this is a quote from him: "As far as design goes, we cut down on unused space as much as possible. We change the location for the CPU and raise the house for the battery. The guys in charge of the board design really put their shoulders to the wheel. The parts are really packed in, but we were under pressure to keep the price down." And then Iwata goes, "Sorry about that," and laughs. um, they wanted the DSi to be a part of people's everyday life. Another excerpt from the Iwata asks, has another quote. Masato Kuwahara has another quote: "Hopefully, each person's personality would be reflected in their DS, and they wouldn't be able to." And they wouldn't be able to take their hands off of it. It would be great if it became so integral to them that if they accidentally left it at the house without it in the morning, they would hurry back to get it. And then Iwata replies, "Yeah, I want each person's My DS to be something." I guess that was like an app on the DSi, the My DS section of it. To be something they carry around with them at all times. They can take an interest in what their friends have done with their units and share recommendations. One of the other workers of the development engineering department, Kintaro Mita, chimed in right after that, saying, "One important feature of the concept of My DS was being able to take and save pictures. You can view them on a screen larger than that of a cell phone and place it on your desk like a photo stand. I want it to be a device that people will always keep out on their desk, for example, rather than stuff in their bag." And then Kuwahara replied, "Since you can save your own photos, you're sure to want your own console rather than, say, share your big brother's. I'm sure my own children will be that way." And that was the last quote that I have. But I thought that was interesting that they even considered having people use it as like a digital picture frame, you know?
Hmm. The DSi I have such mixed opinions on. That is actually really interesting, though. I like that their idea was like it could do all of these really cool things, but then of course, like their whole thing is like we don't want people to just immediately throw it in their bag. But unfortunately, that's kind of what most people end up
I mean,
doing.
that's what it's for.
Yeah,
I don't know what you mean.
yeah. Like, uh, is it bad that like the reason why I didn't want one of these things back in the day as a kid was strictly because they got rid of the GBA slot?
No, people were cranky about that. I don't blame them.
I mean, that was a huge drawing point for the DS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like those, like we were saying earlier, the GBA was like, it was only around for like less than 3 years before the DS came out. And so like those games still were new and felt new to us at the time when the DS was, I guess by the time the DSi was coming out, they were a little older, but they were still relevant. It wasn't like you were, like looking at games that were like ancient at that point, and they were cheap, they were easy to get. Like Game Boy games, GBA games were still around, and so I think that desire to be able to play them was a big part of the draw for the system. I never had a DSi. I wasn't interested in it at that point. You skipped over though what is, like, in my opinion, the greatest hardware revision of all time, maybe second to the 3DS XL, but the DS Lite. I think the DS, the original DS.
I touched on it a little bit.
To the DS Lite.
I mentioned.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah. I mentioned in passing, but go on.
To me, that is like the single biggest leap in a hardware revision. The original, we talked about like the disastrous, ugly, awful launch or announcement version of the DS, and then they redesigned that to like the silver clamshell design, which was still just really ugly. The screen in particular was really bad, and it's still really bad. And they came back around with the DS Lite, and they were just like, Nintendo was just cooking in that time frame, 2004, 2005, 2006, when they were launching stuff like the DS Lite, that all of a sudden it went from looking like a clunky gaming handheld for kids. And they touch on this in the DS Lite or the DSi design quotes that you were just reading, but like to something that looks like it can sit out on your desk and it doesn't look like an eyesore. And I think that like the compact, sort of sleek, rounded corners, the much smaller size of the DS Lite was just a lot more appealing, and it felt solid in your hands. It had that cool clear coat over it, which made it feel a little more premium. But the screen in particular was a huge leap up in quality. And that alone made the leap going from the original launch model to the DS Lite feel like you were going from a prototype to a finished product. It wasn't focused on feature updates or hardware revision and hardware features like the DSi. It was just focused on making that Nintendo DS experience that much better. And it remains like, even with all the other handhelds I have a 3DS and a 3DS XL that can play the DS games. Like my DS Lite, I think, is probably the handheld console I've used most and continue to use the most to play any of those games because it just feels and looks great. And I think, like, we've seen other iterative hardware revisions along the way, but none that have sort of capitalized on the potential of the original hardware quite in the same way as the DS Lite.
It's actually kind of crazy. I never had a DS Lite back in the day when it was relevant. I had my Fat DS, like original one, pretty much its entire run. And I actually think the reasoning why I never got a Lite was because my original DS never died. Like, it still works, but also, like, my parents kind of looked at the Lite and they were like, "Oh, that's just a slightly different version. Yours is fine. You don't need a new one."
Yeah, I was just old enough to be able to buy myself a Lite.
Yeah,
Because I can see how
I was.
parents wouldn't really be able to, like, you couldn't sell them on the camera or the this or the that. But you know, but to me, like, the upgrade in quality was just great to the point where, like, recently I booted up my original Fat DS and put a game on it, and I was like, oh shit, like the screen's broken, like the contrast is just super low and it looks awful. And so I was kind of fiddling around, and I was like, oh no, it's just the screen was just really bad, and I'm used to playing games
Mhm.
on the Lite. And it was that moment that I think I don't even think I necessarily realized at the time how big the leap was in quality between the two devices. But going back and looking at both of them side by side, I was like, I didn't even know it was the same, like the GBA to the GBA SP. It's like, how did I even play games on the original launch model GBA? And it's the
I
same
don't
for
know
the
how we.
same for the Fat DS. Like, I just like both of those. The launch model GBA, the launch model DS are just like, I don't know how I played video games on them. They're both pretty bad. But then they just like evolved into some of the greatest handheld console designs like ever.
Yeah.
I still remember getting my DS Lite. When I finally picked one up, I got it at a GameStop used for $20, and I was just like, hell yeah.
That's
Amazing.
awesome.
Like, yeah, it's so good. I got a pink one. I remember going into the,
Nice.
Best Buy or whatever. I was
Mhm.
with my girlfriend at the time. She's my wife now. Wanted DS Lite. They had whatever, blue and pink, and I was like, like, should get the blue one, but I just really like the pink one. She was like, that's kind of weird, but like, go for it, man. If you like the pink one, get the pink one. And I did. And I just loved it ever since. And I think that's part of the appeal to me, is that it's just like this nice bubblegummy light pink color. And it's not, it doesn't look like a typical video game system that was trying to appeal to like 14-year-old boys at the time. It just looked like something you didn't really see in tech hardware.
And what's weird for me though is I don't hate the visual look of the original DS, but like you can't deny, like, I think I'm the only one, by the way. I think that's my only hot take of this episode, that the original DS, like the physical like clamshell look and design of it, I don't think is as ugly as people always say it is. I don't know why. I just always liked it. But with that said, you can't deny what you're both talking about. Like the DS Lite was a revelation.
Oh yeah.
It's insane. Also, real very odd random fun fact I did not include on the outline because I'm like, well, you know what, I'm not going to include it, but maybe I will. They in on the DSi, when they upgraded the DS Lite to the DSi, they actually changed the speakers for like the for when you hear the sound. So the DSi has better audio playback and whatnot, so it should sound better. They also changed how the speakers work, because if you notice on the DS Lite, there's like six like holes on the left and another six holes on the right for where the audio comes out. And the DSi, it's just got two little like lines, one on each side. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. It just reminded me, because I'm looking at a picture of all four iterations of the DS. The original DS Lite, DSi, and then the DSi XL. but the light was just amazing, man. Like I love that system so much. Mine was red. Like I said, I bought it pre-owned. I do remember, and we can use this then as unless you guys have anything else to talk about with with the hardware. I want to kind of transition to just some of our favorite games. We can talk about some of our favorite memories around games. What were you going to say, Bill?
I did want to bring up one thing on the hardware because we kind of glazed over this actually, but the two screens. I always thought the whole idea of like what developers would do with the two screens was like a super fascinating thing. It ended up a lot of them would eventually kind of settle on something which is kind of it's one of the cool like my favorite aspects of DS games. But the whole idea of like the game would be on top and then the bottom you'd have like the map, like and you just
Yeah.
you would never have to look at the map again in games because it would always be there.
It's funny because like that's the most obvious way to do it, especially like in RPGs, which is what I mostly play. But some games went outside, the box, and like I got into the Dragon Quest series thanks to the remakes, and we can talk about them a little bit more later in the game section. But they just stacked the viewable area across the top and the bottom screens, and so you had this vertical orientation of the game world, which I thought looked cool at the time. But it's funny because like I hate vertical orientation gaming on phones. Like Dragon Quest VIII came out and on phones, and it has vertical orientation, and other like the other Dragon Quest remakes, you can play them with vertical orientation. I despise it. Like it just feels wrong like to me. But on the DS, games would do that. They'd use the top and the bottom screen. They just display the field and you'd run around, and I think your character always stayed on the bottom. So maybe that's part of what made it work. But for some reason, seeing the game world kind of moving around on those two screens was always kind of fun to me. And then I guess because it was also a novelty at the time, and that was just to display game systems. And of course, there was lots of puzzle based stuff like I think I mentioned Hotel Dusk and Last Window, which you played in like you turned the DS sideways, right, and used it as in the orientation of like a paperback book, and you had
book style,
and you had like the touch screen, which was like a map, and you would move around by moving on the touch screen and dragging the stylus around where you wanted to go, and then on the non-touch screen on the other side. So for me on the left side, it was like a first person representation of the world you were moving through. And I just adore those games. And that's an experience you just cannot and could not have, or would have to be significantly altered if you were to try to take it off of the DS. And, I really liked seeing developers who were like, okay, we have this opportunity here. We have two screens. What can we do with it?
I also really loved with the two screens when they would do the cuts. I think did you guys talk about the cutscenes? I'm so sorry. You ever like when cutscenes would go from the bottom screen to the top, and you would see like I don't know, just seeing how like it made it feel much grander when the cutscene was like so epic that it couldn't fit on one screen. It would have to go to the top screen too, or down to the bottom or something like that. And also with the flipbook style, you mentioned. Shout out to Ninja Gaiden. That game was actually a lot of fun.
I never actually played it. I always wanted to. It looked gorgeous, and it used that book style. One of my like favorite implementations of two screens was actually on the 3DS with Dragon Quest XI, where it shipped with a 16-bit version and like a 3DS style version of Dragon Quest XI, and eventually you had to choose between one or the other. But for the first couple hours of the game, you had the 16-bit version of Dragon Quest XI on the lower screen, and then like a DS style 32-bit style version of Dragon Quest XI on the top screen, and you played them at the same time. And to me, just like, not only does it look cool, but just the game logic of keeping a 2D explorable space matched up and in sync with a 3D explorable space that you're moving through at the exact same time is just like bananas to me. And the way that they would have had to design around the limitation and freedom of doing both of those things is cool. And that wasn't the DS, but I think the origins and the roots of that is like with DS gaming, introducing that second screen.
One other thing I want to shout out before we get into the games as well. I had it on the outline, but it's a very brief thing. The DS download stations. Those things were fucking cool, man. I didn't have a DS at the time when they would have been a thing, but did for those who don't know, the DS download stations were basically, and they had it in a number of different ways, but there's basically you could go to a store and you could search for the DS download stations, and it was a way for while you were in the store, if you brought your DS with you, you could download game demos, you could download trailers, and you could then play stuff on your DS and just play demos in the store. And it was loaded into RAM, into memory. So like if you walked away from it, you'd keep the demo, I believe, as long as your system was on. But once you turn your system off, then you're done. Or if you like back out of it and somehow and go back to the menu of even if you could, I don't think you could. I think you had to restart the DS entirely to restart the whole thing. But you would only be able to download it if you were within close proximity to these DS download stations, which were literally just DSs that had a cartridge in them, and it was broadcasting the signal, and you just had to be close enough to the DS to download whatever it was. What's crazy, you can buy these cartridges on eBay for relatively cheap, for like $20 a pop. I bought the first one. I have a DS download station cart and it works. I don't think these would be counterfeited because you're only spending $20 on, like, I haven't seen anything more than $20-$40, right? Like, it's not like it's a Pokemon game which sell for hundreds, and so it would make sense for people to counterfeit them. Also, mine has like a sticker on the back of it's like, not for resale, not for sale type of thing. But it works. It was really cool. They also had stations like this, and I remember when I worked at GameStop for Pokemon events.
Yep.
Like, you would come into your GameStop and download a Pokemon you would connect to it like at the Pokemon Center, and you could get a Pokemon out of it. It was kind of cool.
That's how you did the mystery gifts, and that's how you got like all those like bonus like areas and stuff unlocked, I believe.
It just kind of lends to the point you made before, Aidan, about how like this system was all about connecting people, like in being able to connect with the community that you were playing with in different and unique ways. Like, if you think about it, like if you just like people would go into GameStops just to get those gifts in Pokemon, and you would all connect around, like you would meet other Pokemon fans that way. And Pokemon's always been about that kind of connection in one way, shape, or form. But even with the DS download stations, like you could go into a store and play games and whatnot, which is just from there. Fun fact too, I don't know which one it is. I think there's like 19 or 20 different DS download station cartridges that you can buy. At least one of them, I don't know if there's more than one, but at least one of them has a demo for a game that ended up never being released. So you can actually play a game that doesn't exist anymore. Like, it's the only way you'll ever experience it is in the demo provided by the DS download station.
Huh.
Which is kind of cool. I can do some digging on it. I think where I first learned about it was from Nintendrew's channel on YouTube. He had a video about it, which was really cool. So I went on eBay and found one. I have not bought another one since, but I am very tempted. Still very tempted to buy another DS download station. I actually kind of want to like. It's a dream of mine that once I get my game room set up, I'll get like a DS display, and then get like a DS that I can just turn on and have the download station running for when friends come over, just cause, even if they don't bring their DS. I just kind of want to do that just because I think it'd be fun to have a DS download station in my house.
Nice.
Love it.
Anyway, to wrap up this episode, before we wrap it, because we have been going for almost 2 hours now, we got to talk about the games. We've touched on a bunch, but we should talk about some of our favorite games for the system. Like, this system has so many amazing titles. I'll start off first just to give you guys some time to think about some of the games you want to bring up, because I guarantee some of the ones that I remember and played are probably not going to be on your lists. One, and not because they're good games either. One of my favorites that I should say favorites, one of the most interesting ones to me was actually the Call of Duty games for the system. They were completely different experiences, for better or worse. Like, I remember I was playing Call of Duty World at War for the system, and like you actually have to like if you come across it's a bad first person shooter for it because you move forward, backward, strave left, and strave right with the D-pad, and then you use the touchpad to look around, and then to fire you tap on the screen. So it's or maybe I think you have to hit R. So like you're holding like three different things really awkwardly to shoot. It was uncomfortable. But the cool parts of it was that you could actually like if you came across a mine or something like that, you would a mini game screen would pop up, and you would have to like unscrew the screws from the mine to take the plate off, and then you'd have to disarm the mine. And so they did use the touch screen in a really interesting way. It wasn't great. Just being completely honest, it wasn't anything like fantastic. But the reason I bring it up is because at the time I was really into Call of Duty. I'm like, I wonder what Call of Duty would be like on a handheld, and it was just so different from anything that I was expecting it to be. But I still want to shout it out because I admire them for trying something to make it interesting on something that probably wasn't meant to even handle that type of game. So I want to give them some props for at least trying something, you know. But Aidan, I want to throw it over to you. We can kind of go back and forth. What's one of your favorite games for the system?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big Japanese RPG sicko, so I was kind of in heaven with especially the later years of the DS. So, the Chrono Trigger remaster is in my opinion, still the best way to play the game. I also got into it, like I said earlier, the Dragon Quest series with the DS and the three remakes of 4, 5, and 6. I had been into RPGs a lot earlier for most of my life, but that was my first experience with Dragon Quest. And, then I since have gone back and played a bunch of the older ones and kept up with the series. But I just really loved the way that it took sort of those traditional, Dragon Quest titles, but made them so snappy and fast. And it uses like the visual style of Dragon Quest 7 on the PlayStation, which I always thought was awful. And I was kind of turned off Dragon Quest because, while I was playing Final Fantasy 7 and 8 and Chrono Cross and all those, Dragon Quest 7 was sitting there looking like, the way that it did. But for whatever reason, that art style just translated so nicely to the DS, and I couldn't get enough of them. And they came out like, 4 and 5 came out within like a few months of each other. I think I remember basically playing them back to back and not getting sick of it. And then 6 came a bit later, but just as a JRPG fan, I was just, feasting. Another standout for me is 4 Warriors of Light, which is like a Final Fantasy spinoff, which has this really cool, like rolling cylinder type world and like a storybook kind of world. Like it almost feels like it doesn't go like Paper Mario style, but it almost feels like, a pop-up book style world. And it was sort of the predecessor to Bravely Default as well. And so, you just had really traditional stuff like Dragon Quest and Chrono Trigger. Then you had these sort of oddball Japanese RPGs, like 4 Warriors of Light, and it just like kind of ranged from everything I knew and loved, and everything I didn't quite know I loved yet.
Bill, over to you.
So if I had to think of like my absolute favorite DS game, it's actually Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story, like another excellent RPG on the system. It's like a perfect example of like, so the first Mario and Luigi on DS was Partners in Time, and that one's kind of you could clearly tell they hadn't quite embraced the DS yet. Like the only example of like using the touchscreen is I think you rub dirt off a piece of paper at one point. But Bowser's Inside Story, they went like all in with the DS's hardware. Like they really use a lot of the 2 screens for like battle effects, which was present in Partners in Time as well, but they really made it like a full-on feature in Bowser's Inside Story. They use a whole bunch of touchscreen mechanics. Like they brought up this really cool idea where when you're playing on the main overworld, mostly as Bowser, it plays like a traditional Mario and Luigi game. But then when you're playing inside Bowser for the Mario and Luigi segments, it's like a 2D side scroller, which really kind of added a whole bunch of variety to the gameplay. The story and writing in those games is just phenomenal. Like I love how zany and out there is, especially considering the main characters don't talk like at all throughout the game. Well, Bowser talks, but the Mario brothers don't at all, which always leads to some really interesting interpretations. The battle system is still my favorite battle system in any RPG ever. Like there's just something really intuitive about a battle system where if you are good enough, you can never take a hit, which is just really impressive to me. Um, yeah, I love those games. Like another series like that I got into with the DS would actually probably be obviously like Ace Attorney. Like I think I really went on my my visual novel like deep dive with
Mm-hmm.
the DS back in the day. Like I straight up binged.
Jake Hunter.
Oh yeah, like I binged every single Ace Attorney game within like a week when because I didn't play them till way later on. But yeah, I binged through every single one in a week, and then I got to Apollo Justice and kind of lost interest at that one. But yeah, a whole bunch of awesome series. Like the DS was such a formative time for my gaming back in the day.
I remember playing Kirby Mass Attack on my honeymoon. I brought my DS on my honeymoon and I played Kirby Mass Attack. I never beat it because I think I got to a point where it was like, because each level you have to complete, like in order to beat the game, you have to complete each level with a certain number of Kirby's. Because the whole appeal of that is that you end up with like a shitload of Kirby's. Like you have your main Kirby, but then you can also end up with like 40 following you type of thing. And so the objective is to beat the levels, but then in order to actually beat the game, you have to beat every level with a certain number of Kirby's. Like it's different for each level. I forget the amount. It could be like 6 or 7 or 10 or something like that. And if you don't, even if you've beaten levels but you haven't beaten them with the correct number of Kirby's, they will stonewall you at some point and you can't finish the game. And when that happened, I went, fuck this, and I left. I was like, I'm not doing that. I don't want that. I also really love, it was the first time I ever played it, the Mario versus Donkey Kong March of the Minis. I love that game, man. I really, really enjoy that type of like puzzle game. It's really fun. I know the Mario versus Donkey Kong existed on the Game Boy Advance, I guess, first, and this is just kind of like an evolution of that. And technically, you could even trace it back to Donkey Kong 94 for the Game Boy, which had like it wasn't a similar style of gameplay, but it kind of, you can see the roots of it in there. I also want to shout out Super Princess Peach. Really, really fun game. Problematic elements aside about how all of Peach's powers are based entirely around her emotions. The gameplay is fantastic. It's just why you got to be like that, Nintendo. Like
That's that one's in my DS right now. I was playing it just before this, and yeah, it's a fantastic platformer. It's super creative. A little problematic 20 years later.
I just it's the definition of like one step forward, two steps back, where it's like, hey, we're making Peach her own, like the main character of her own game. She has to save Mario. Isn't that awesome, everybody? Oh, but by the way, the only way you can beat this is to manipulate her emotions the entire time.
And they always highlighted the anger and crying ones. And it's always like, this is wonderful.
Yeah. Even my like kid, like 8-year-old at the time, was playing it, and she's like, why is it just about making her cry all the time? And I was like, yeah.
I didn't have this game as a kid. I wasn't interested. My sister Alex did. She hated it. Like she was like, this is stupid. Like, why is it all the buttons don't do it? Like it pissed her off. And I'm like, wow, like what an interesting dynamic.
I don't always trust Alex's gaming opinions though, since she prefers the Jaguar over to the N64. I don't know.
I don't even know what she's on half the time with that.
No, I know it's a running bit. Back over to you though, Aidan. Like some of the other games, any other games you want to shout out?
Yeah, I mean, I could shout out games on the Nintendo DS like all night. It was a big, like it was a kind of a comfort console for me because it had all the RPGs. It was also where I spent the most time playing like puzzle games. It has like the best version of Tetris, in my opinion, with Tetris DS, which like had all the Nintendo cameos and Nintendo skins. And it's like, I'm not a Tetris sicko by any means. Like I play it casually. And that's the one to me that stands out as like, the best version of Tetris ever released. But then also like really kind of unique, interesting puzzle games like Medios, which was similar to Luminous, and it had like a rhythm-based sort of puzzle element to it. which was also like, Elite Beat Agents, and the Japanese version, which was basically an entire different game. And so bringing in like sort of like those puzzle games and those rhythm games, which were genres I didn't really play before or even really after. Like I was so sort of like caught up in online like gaming community stuff and the One Up network, and like, they would talk about Elite Beat Agents, and I was like, yeah, I gotta get Elite Beat Agents. Like, let's do this. Like, let's import the Japanese version because it has different songs. It is basically a different game. And so like, there was that like creative risk from the people making games, but also for like, I think a lot of people who are playing games. Like when a DS game costs $35 instead of whatever a game costs now, like when I buy a new game now for my PlayStation 5, it literally comes to over $100 after tax in Canada. Back in the 20 years ago, I could get a DS game and it would be $35, and so I was more willing to take those chances, and I found amazing games like Elite Beat Agents, Rhythm Heaven. Actually, I didn't like the DS Rhythm Heaven, but yeah. So all those puzzle games, all those rhythm games were great. Going back, like I think the visual novel boom on the DS was a real thing. Like that's definitely where I discovered
Oh yeah,
that
yeah.
genre. Like all the Ace Attorney games. I've talked about Hotel Dusk and how much I love that. Professor Layton is it's more puzzly than visual novel, but it's in there too, and I really liked it. And then gosh, there was one more that I wanted to bring up that I just really liked, and I can't remember what it is.
It's not Sprung, is it?
No, it was not. It's not Sprung.
Okay. Sprung's an interesting one too.
Yeah, no, I did not play that one, but yeah. In any case, all like the story-driven, slower, paced, like visual novels and visual novel adjacent series were really. Oh, I know what it was. Well, not really a visual novel, but sort of in that same realm. It was Ghost Trick, which is
Ghost
like
Trick.
just one of my
yeah,
like
yeah.
all-time favorite games, and like from like just its like pizzazz and style, its visual, like just the character of its visuals, from its like incredible animations to Rocket the little Pomeranian, the music, the story, like everything about it is just a perfect game. And it languished, stuck on the DS for so long, and only recently was sort of released as with a modern remaster. And I was so happy that new people would get to experience that game for the first time, because in my opinion, it's like a perfect video game. And it was perfect. I bought
the
on the
remaster.
DS.
Haven't touched it yet.
Yeah, I haven't played it. I'm almost like afraid to, because my memories of the original are so strong, and I have it on DS. But it's so good, and I just, Ghost Trick is like the type of game that would be so hard to see it find a home nowadays outside of like indie development, where you're seeing more of that. I don't even know if indie developers could really make Ghost Trick. Like it required such a like, unique and precise sort of experience of like combining visuals and storytelling and all that kind of stuff. That of course, there are great indie developers out there who could do it, but I don't know. It just seemed like such a like culmination of everything that made the DS so unique. Like you had big companies putting their best people on small games and pumping out some pretty incredible stuff. And it just feels like the modern, game space. You'd be hard pressed to find that, especially in like the mainstream game publishing world.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Meteos. I real quick just want to shout that out. Not because I've actually played it, but I just recently did a Patreon bonus episode all about Sakurai on creating video games. Masahiro Sakurai on creating video games. He developed that game. He was the director on that.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Kind of like thinking back on it and stuff. That's funny. That was a good game. That was cool. The soundtrack was out of this world. It was so good.
Bill, throwing it over to you, and then I'll close it out with close out the game section with some of my other highlights.
Okay. We had mentioned them earlier in the episode, but I really wanted to bring up again the Dementium games, Dementium the Warden. It's a sequel, Dementium 2. I guess to anyone who hasn't experienced these games, the best way to describe them is it's literally like Silent Hill meets Doom 3, like where it takes place in like this like abandoned hospital. These are like some creepy, unsettling games for the DS. Like the DS, like I think like infamously had like 11 M-rated games total. and those were
Mhm.
two of them, and they are in a lot of ways some of the most interesting games on the system. Like they are legitimately like kind of like they really kind of like unsettle you in a way that like handheld games don't generally do. And I remember I found those just like super engaging in a lot of ways.
And now you know you can get them on the Switch again. For myself to round this one out, obviously, the classics that we've touched on already, new Super Mario Brothers, hell, even Mario Kart DS. I'm famously not a Mario Kart fan, though I did play a decent amount of Mario Kart DS back in the day. uh, Also, let me see, just kind of scrolling through. Actually, you know what, I have my app up right now that has a list of all my games. I'll have to bring that open. 1 second, let me do that really quick.
One quick note about Mario Kart DS I wanted to bring up just because I think it's kind of interesting. That is like the one Mario Kart game I can think of where you can like play the game exclusively looking at the map down below and just be just as good as you would be looking up top.
That's very true. That's very true. Um, Let me
You know
see
what?
here.
That's kind of like that is something with the DS though. Like I would play like so the Castlevania games I think are worth mentioning as
Mm.
well. And there's great Castlevania games. I would like play Castlevania games or Chrono Trigger or some of the RPGs like just looking at the map as I played. You know, kind of watching for enemies out of the corner or I guess the top of my eye as I went around. But like in some ways something like Castlevania, the experience changes when the map is right there in front of you. Same with RPGs. Like I actually have gotten to a point where like I tend to like to turn mini maps off in RPGs because otherwise you see that it's just like straight lines or it's a very simple map layout. And it almost like shows you the you know behind the scenes or it pulls back the curtain a little bit and you're like, oh yeah, this is just like level map that somebody's designed. And I think that kind of started for me on the DS with having the map right down there at the bottom and always being able to just like refer to it instead of finding my way or orienting my way through like landmarks within the game world itself.
Um, I was able to pull up my list of games that I own here. Want to shout out Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword. I already mentioned that beforehand. Also, I really want to shout out, or sorry, the big one I want to shout out, I'll shout out in just a second. But this one I played one time while I was waiting for my wife when she was getting a procedure done in the hospital. She's fine. It was just a quick procedure. Shrek the Third is honestly a surprisingly fun little like license game on the DS. It's a little buggy. It's not well programmed, but it was a fun little like adventure game where like you play as either Shrek, Donkey, or Puss in Boots, and they each have different abilities, and you have to use them to traverse across the level and like solve different puzzles, and you switch back and forth between them. It wasn't anything like groundbreaking, but it was fun. Sonic Rush is also a really fun game on there. I'm not like a diehard Sonic fan, but I really enjoyed that. The one that I really want to shout out, and I touched on it before, The World Ends With You.
Mm.
I adore that game, man. That game, it just oozes style. Like I know that's part of the intention that fashion is a major element of the gameplay even, but just like everything about it just is just fun and cool, and just the world building is fantastic. It is such a great game, and I never played the newest one. Is what is it? The World Ends With You Neo.
Mhm.
Haven't touched that yet. I've heard it's not as good as the original, but I just love the dual screen combat, how you use the D-pad for combat on the top screen and then you use the touch pad for combat on the bottom screen. And the amount of stuff they were able to do with the touchpad, where it's like, if you tap on the screen it will shoot a fireball, but if you tap and hold it might do a flamethrower, depending on what pins, which are your abilities, what pins you have equipped. Or if you draw a circle around an enemy, it might like bind them. Or if you draw a line through them, it does a slash. Or if you draw, like, it was all predicated on like very simple pen movements, but they found so many different ways to make it interesting. And also, like, since you can only equip so many pins at once, you were able to even if one pin mimicked the same movement as another, it I don't think it even really did. They did such a good job of like finding unique ways for all of the different touchpad touchpad movements and touchpad touches. It was all different and unique. It's such a great game, man. I love that game so much.
Nice.
I think like thinking about all these games we're talking about, one of the like interesting things about the DS is it was like it did 3D and it did 2D in a way that a lot of other consoles didn't do. Like the Nintendo 64 was like very 3D heavy. The PlayStation did both, but it was also trying to push 3D. By the time the DS came out, 3D was established. Nintendo wasn't trying to like push 3D as the future anymore. But 3D on the DS is pretty rudimentary. It's not great. It's most of the 3D games are pretty ugly, but the 2D games like The World Ends With You or like the Castlevania games are incredible. And you have pixel art and pixel artists who were working at the top of their game on like a fixed, like a low resolution. So you just had like some of the best like world-class pixel art up against some like really janky 3D games. And it's such a funny system that way because there's like, I can look at a lot of systems and be like, oh yeah, that looks like a Nintendo 64 game, right? It looks like a Super Nintendo game or a Genesis game. You can like look at a screenshot and almost know which system it's from. The DS has such a incredibly broad spectrum of games, from the Dragon Quest, remakes to Super Princess Peach to there's a Alice in Wonderland RPG that's pretty good that has like weird 3D graphics. To like just all along the spectrum, to the Metroid Prime Hunters first person 3D shooter stuff. Like you can't look at a game and say this is what a Nintendo DS game looks like, because everything a Nintendo DS game could look like anything. And I find that really charming about the system. From like really low end janky low tech 3D to like some of the absolute best pixel art out there. That's just such a snapshot in time of what gaming was sort of in the early 2000s.
Yeah. And God, I miss it. I miss it so much. Let's move that. That's actually a nice transition, Aidan. We can move into our final thoughts, like the legacy of the system, what we feel on it, how it makes us feel now. I'll start off just so that way I can give you wonderful guests the final word on the system, and I'm not rambling too much at the very end. I think ultimately what this system, like, how can I put this? I get very whimsical when I look back at video game nostalgia. Like, even if it's something I'm nostalgic for that I never personally experienced. I've said it before, I've misplaced nostalgia for the NES. I didn't get to experience it when it was contemporary. I missed a lot of that stuff. But the reason I say I'm whimsical about it is when I look at the NES and the cartridges and stuff like that, I just look at it in the sense that like this was a system of this little gray box that you could just plug this cartridge in and it would take people to other worlds. And like I can almost picture the community and like the world that existed when it was contemporary. And the DS, to bring that up to this, it was something I also kind of missed out on in terms of the community aspect of it. I think that's also why I referenced the NES, because that had a strong community aspect as well. But instead of it being online or however the DS did it, it was all done with playgrounds, and you would always talk to your friends in the playground about like what you were doing in a game type of thing. And the DS kind of feels like the next level up of that, right? Like they had the Picto Chat. They had all the different ways you could play with each other on the download cards that we've already touched on. Like I get whimsical about it because it just makes me feel like I can look at a DS and almost feel like I'm going back to that time when you could just hang out in a Picto Chat room and just bullshit with friends. And also, I don't know if this is true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was used to get some kids in trouble, because like it's not like it was like regulated or anything like that. Like if you had friends in the neighborhood and you were talking to each other in Picto Chat, you could probably plan things and pick the chat, because no one's going to be able to read it. It goes away once you leave the chat room, um but I don't know, but I just look at the DS, and it feels like it is still, even 20 years later, it's still this portal to all these amazing, unique experiences and worlds. And it feels like it's an era of game history that we won't ever get back. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I feel like every era of game history, you're going to find something new, a different version of that same feeling. And it just depends on like what you grew up with. But I'm kind of bummed I missed out on the communal aspects of this, because I feel like one of the coolest things about the DS was the community. And I really admire the system for what it did in terms of like reinventing how to play games through a touchpad. For better or worse, this system, we didn't really touch on it, but it did have a lot of shovelware. Like, no ifs, ands, or buts. There was a lot of shovelware on it, but that doesn't detract from it for me, because lots of systems do end up getting shovelware on it. Though, what is it? There was there was a House game, like based off the TV show House.
Well,
Like,
there's the Korean House, the greatest anime game ever made.
Corey. It's just every like TV show. Like, there was a Bachelor game for it,
Yeah.
and Bachelorette, stuff like that. It just, I don't know. I love this system just because, to me, it represents like this very whimsical time in game history. And I understand that's completely from my perspective. I'm not saying that as it was a whimsical time where anything was possible. It was just, it feels like that to me, looking back on it and remembering what I was when it was contemporary, my experiences with it. That's just what I love about it. Just a very kind of like happy time, at least for me. But Aidan, we'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. There's always the saying, or the question is like, do you miss the Nintendo DS, or do you miss being 20? And I think that's very much it for me. Like, it has a remarkable library. It came about at the right time for me as I was expanding sort of in some ways my world was expanding, but my social world was contracting because I was finishing high school. And so I was working and meeting new people that way, but at the same time, I wasn't seeing my best friends every day for 6 hours a day. And so, the social features changed. The way I was social with video games changed at that time, and that has a lot of meaning to me. And, I lived on an island. I've probably talked about this on this podcast before, but I grew up on an island, so I was on a ferry like a lot. And so I have just memories of just sitting, waiting for the ferry, playing the Dragon Quest games, that will forever be with me. And it just brings to mind that particular time in my life when, it was a really good time for me. And that association with those games is never going to be removed from my opinion of the system. And, it can have the best games in the world, but, there's kids growing up right now with their Switches, and they're going to look back on the Switch the way that we're looking back on the DS. And
Probably,
I think that's, that's great, because it isn't necessarily always what is the best system. It's like, what are your best memories and what were your best experiences with gaming, and where did they happen? And were you 18 years old or whatever, were you 12 years old? It's hard to match that feel. But every time I look at my DS library, or I crack open my DS Lite for some Super Princess Peach or some Kirby Canvas Curse, like, it takes me right back to that point.
Bill.
Honestly, like, the DS to me is a very interesting one. Like, I kind of see it as like, it was like the turning point for gaming. Like gaming was like one way before the DS, and then it completely became an entirely different thing after the DS. Like, where things got more like online and more. It was the start of like the graphics push and like the games bigger corporations pushing in. Like, the DS always felt like this kind of point in time where games were still small, and like the community aspect of them was very much more alive. Like, the DS to me, I think, is like the last true like community based like system where like everything like you had to do it was like a group activity. Like, you would like share the stories, you'd actually face to face play together with like the link the multiplayer features. And it was like the last time where like every game to me felt like a 100% genuine effort. Like, because one of my issues with modern gaming is a lot of games come out and they feel obviously unfinished because a lot of developers will just finish them with patches later on.
Yeah.
DS,
Yeah.
the DS to me is like that last real era where like every game that came out, I feel like that was like the biggest genuine effort that developer could put out at the time, whether it was a good game or not. And it's a time of gaming that I kind of no, I do miss it all the time. And sometimes I wish gaming kind of stayed in this direction.
I could see that. I could see that. And I like what you were saying, Aidan. I'm also with you on that, and that like the each era is going to be something like the way we feel about the DS, the way kids who grew up in the 80s feel about the NES. There's always going to be that feeling, but with a different console for a different generation. I think the Switch is the next closest to this, obviously. And I at first I was going to push back on what you said, Bill, how you were like, oh, it's the last community driven one. I'm like, well, the Switch is pretty communal, but it's online communal. It's not in person communal. And that's different. It's not bad different. It's just different. And I'm kind of with you in that it kind of stinks that it's not like that, because realistically when you're kids, that's the only time you can actually have that type of communal experience easily. For us adults, once you get a big boy job or a big kid job, you have to plan those communal events. Like, look at this. We're three grown-ass men scheduled to record over a 2.5 hour conversation on a Saturday night. We had to schedule that. We couldn't just like hop online and play with a friend, or like go over to a friend's house and just play games for games or whatnot. You have to schedule this shit, and I think part of that is like it. I wonder if we'll never truly know if kids get a similar experience, because we can't even replicate it now, because we have we have work and we have responsibilities, So I don't know. I think at the very least, a good way to wrap this up is that the DS represents childhood for many. Even if you experienced it as an adult, I feel like it just represents childhood in like the best possible way, and I mean that sincerely as a compliment. But all right, I think that will do it for this episode, y'all. Unless do either of you have any final words, final say that you want to go off with?
My only thing I'd like to ask is, how many of you guys lost your damn styluses?
Oh, all the time.
I still got mine. Still got my original.
I remember I used a pencil or Connect piece.
There's one thing I want to leave off on, which is to shout out like a Nintendo DS style game that I love that's contemporary, and it's called A Short Hike. It's on like Switch and stuff, and it really feels to me like a modern game made within the space or the headspace of like what the Nintendo DS kind of represented. And it's very modern in some ways. It's this very tiny little open world exploration game. But it's just beautiful. It has these really chunky 3D graphics. I feel like it's like a love letter to what the DS was back then. And I hope we continue to see games like that. We saw the like Rise and 16-bit games, inspired games, and we're starting to see like 32-bit inspired games. And I hope we see
Country.
Crow Country is a great example. Yeah. And I hope we see more games that like, bring that Nintendo DS spirit forward. Whether those are, like 3D survival horror games or open world narrative games, or whether they're puzzle games that kind of bring that on the go feel back. The DS, I think, just has a ton to offer in terms of like inspiring people to kind of explore game design creatively and just like don't be held back by bounds of like gameplay loops you've seen in the past, or the the way that game engines do this or do that in modern times. Like everything, like I think Bill, you were just saying, like everything on the DS felt like it was its own unique little finished product, whether it was good or polished or not. It felt like something that was sort of like created within its own means rather than like relying on existing middleware or game engines or gameplay loops. And I hope that that can kind of continue to inspire people making games nowadays.
I think that's the perfect way to end this episode. That's a great sentiment to leave off on. Yeah, that will do it for this episode, y'all. That's our discussion on the Nintendo DS. Thank you all so much for listening. Before we all go, though, we should all shout out what we're doing, what we're up to, what we got going on. Aidan, I'll start off with you. Actually, no, sorry. I started off with Aidan last time. Bill, I'll start off with you. Where can the good people find you online, and what would you like to promote?
So I've shared on the past my couple of guest appearances. I'm currently the host of 3 ongoing podcasts. I have the gaming and collecting podcast I do with my sister. I have the 3DO Experience, a retrospective podcast I do with my buddy Thrak, and then I have a Geek Addicts. That's a more general pop culture podcast I do with my a good friend Matt. I'd actually like to shout out a project I'm currently involved with. It is I've recently joined a group called the Superpod Network, and I'd just like to shout out the group and all the creators over there. We're kind of trying to build up this large group of different podcasters. We do a whole bunch of obviously podcasts. We're doing videos now. We're doing different blogs, like writing style things. Trying to build up, do some more group collaborations, and it's been a fun time just like getting the community together. That's superpodnetwork.com.
All right. Friend of the show, Aaron, who runs the Superpod Network, or well, Superpod Saga is his show, and he runs the Superpod Network, correct?
He is the founder. We kind of currently it's kind of we have a bit of a collaborative, like the group, like some of us, like the people, the originals, like people who kind of started it, we all kind of pitch in and throw ideas around. We like to joke Aaron's the boss CEO, and he gets very embarrassed when we bring that up to him. But yeah, it's a cool time. Like Aaron's a really good guy. We also got Jerry from Super Ghost Radios over there. Nave and Philip from Gaming Together, just a whole bunch of different shows. There's a ton of them. I could I don't want to forget anybody, but there's a ton right now.
All right. That's superpodnetwork.com.
Yes.
All right. Aidan, over to you.
Yeah, so I am around on the internet. I'm on Blue Sky at aidanis.fun. You can find me there just by, searching on Blue Sky. I am no longer on Twitter, so don't find me there. I have a newsletter that I think would probably appeal to fans of the show. It's about video games and books and video game books, which are sort of my 2 backgrounds. I read a lot about video games now. I used to be a book critic, so I still cover books on my newsletter. You can find that at astrolabe.aidanmoher.com. And like I said earlier, I have a book, Fight Magic Items, about the history of Japanese RPGs in the West. And I'm working on my next book. It's in revisions. I need to get that back to my editor before I start on my 3rd book. So if you like, the Nintendo DS, you like Dragon Quest 4, 5, and 6, you like Chrono Trigger, you like all those games we were talking about today, I think you'll like some of the books I've written.
Yes, you definitely will. Like I said, I can't recommend Fight Magic Items enough. Definitely check it all out. As for myself, you can follow me on Facebook. I am still on Twitter. I actually recently announced I'm going to be getting off the platform for my mental health. I will be doing that. By the time this episode comes out, I will be fully off of it. I'm removing it from my phone. Only reason I'm still going to be on it is to post episodes, but I'm no longer going to be actively checking it every single day from my phone. So just need to get off of that place. But I am on there. Twitter, where I'm more active though. Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, all that good stuff at Still Loading Pod. I also have a Twitch at Still Loading Pod over there. I stream usually every Tuesday and Saturday nights, unless I'm recording, which actually I'm recording on a Saturday. We are recording a Saturday night tonight. But yeah, you can watch me play games over there at Still Loading Podcast on YouTube. If you want to support the show, there's a number of ways you can do so. If you like this episode and you want to hear more like it, please consider giving the show a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use. It helps more people find the show. It pleases the algorithm gods. It helps me out a lot, and it just takes a little bit of time to do that. If you really like the show, I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For as little as $1 a month, you get all the episodes a little bit earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights, which by the time this episode comes out, there will be another poll happening in another month or so. For my every year I do a backlog month poll where I have 16 games go up, and the top 4 vote getters, like whichever 4 games get the most votes out of the 16 I put up, I will cover as a big backlog month, part of an official backlog month. Like this past year, it was Dirge Cerberus, it was Toe Jam and Earl, it was Donkey Kong Country, and it was The Order 1886. Those are all games I had never played before, and I finally got I either have played but never beaten, or never played at all, and I beat them all with the exception of Toe Jam and Earl, because fuck that game. But that you have to go back to listen to that episode on it. But if you want to be a part of that, it says only $1 a month, and you'll get to vote on that Patreon poll. And I also do quarterly polls to help guide the direction of the show. For $3 a month, you get everything I mentioned prior, plus patron shoutouts that you heard at the beginning of this episode. For $4 a month, you get everything prior, plus 2 mini bonus episodes. And then for $5 a month, you get all of that stuff, plus access to my monthly movie podcast, which right now, what is it? The finale of Still Bonding just released, which was my monthly James Bond podcast where me and a bunch of friends bonded over 007. Starting either next month or in January, depending on when I can get my act together, it'll start Still Family, my monthly Fast and Furious movie podcast, where all my guests aren't just friends, they're family. Anyway, that's all over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. That's a long plug. I apologize. That will do it for this episode of Still Loading. Thank you all so much for listening. Aidan, Bill, thank you once again for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.